Listen closely, and you might just hear it, the distant, rhythmic thunder of marching feet, the cold clatter of steel on mail, echoing across the sun-baked hills of 13th century Languedoc. This is not the sound of a simple border dispute or a dynastic squabble. This is the sound of an idea being enforced with a sword. What you are about to witness is one of history's most profound and disturbing secrets, the Albigensian Crusade. For centuries, it has been presented in dusty textbooks as just another medieval religious war, a footnote in the long struggle for power between kings and popes. But to see it that way is to miss the entire, terrifying point. This was not a war for land, nor solely for political control. This was a secret war of ideas, a systematic, brutal campaign by the most powerful institution in the world to completely erase a rival spiritual tradition from the face of the earth. It was a crusade turned inward, a holy war declared not on a foreign infidel, but on fellow Christians whose only crime was a different, more mystical understanding of God and the soul. The target of this immense fury was a group known as the Cathars. They were not mere heretics in the simplistic sense. They were the bearers of a deeply esoteric spirituality that posed a direct and fundamental challenge to the very foundation of the medieval church. Their beliefs, rooted in ancient dualist traditions, painted a picture of the world that was radically different. They saw the material universe not as a divine creation, but as a prison, a flawed realm crafted by a lesser, flawed God. The true God to them was entirely spirit, pure and inaccessible, and the ultimate goal of human life was to break free from this cycle of reincarnation and material suffering. This was a direct threat to an institution that derived its power from controlling the sacraments, the very channels of grace in the physical world. The Cathar perfecti, their spiritual elite, lived lives of extreme austerity, seeking purity of spirit in a world they considered corrupt. Their existence was a silent, powerful critique, and the Church could not allow it to stand. So today, we embark on an investigative journey into this hidden history, peeling back the layers of official narrative to uncover the real spiritual stakes behind the bloodshed. We will walk the same ground where entire cities were put to the sword, where the question, "Kill them all, God will know his own," became a horrifying mantra. But we will look beyond the smoke and the siege engines to understand what was truly being fought over. This is a story about the power of belief, the lengths to which authority will go to maintain its monopoly on truth, and the astonishing resilience of esoteric knowledge. The echoes of this conflict did not fade with the last Cathar perfecti being burned at the stake. They reverberate through the centuries, influencing secret societies, inspiring occult philosophies, and leaving a permanent mark on the landscape of Western spirituality. This is the secret history of the war on heretics, and the story of why a forgotten crusade in the south of France still matters to anyone who has ever questioned the nature of reality, the soul, and the price of spiritual freedom. To truly grasp the magnitude of the coming storm, you have to picture the world it was about to tear apart. In the 12th century, the region known as Languedoc, or Occitania, was not just another European territory. It was a dazzling anomaly, a society that in many ways felt centuries ahead of its time. Nestled in the sun-drenched south of what we now call France, this was a land of independent cities, prosperous trade, and a vibrant vernacular culture. Here, the troubadours reigned supreme. These poet-musicians didn't sing of grim piety and wrathful judgment. They wove intricate verses of courtly love, or finimur, a concept that elevated women to a position of near spiritual authority and celebrated the refined, often secret, longings of the human heart. This was a culture that valued dialogue, intellectual curiosity, and a certain live and let live attitude. It was in this fertile, open-minded environment that Catharism didn't just survive, it flourished. Local nobles, powerful and independent, often protected the Cathar perfecti, seeing them as holy men and women who posed no threat to their temporal rule. The church existed here, of course, but its grip was loose, its authority often questioned in the vibrant town squares and cosmopolitan courts. Now, cast your gaze north. The contrast could not have been more stark. There, the Roman Catholic Church, centered in Rome, was consolidating its power into an unprecedented, rigid hierarchy. This was an institution that saw itself as the sole, universal arbiter of salvation, a spiritual monarchy with the Pope at its apex. Its theology was built on the sanctity of the material world as God's creation, and its power was physically embodied in the sacraments, the bread and wine of the Eucharist, the holy water of baptism. These were tangible things administered by a clerical class that held the keys to heaven. This was a world of absolute binaries, orthodox and heretic, saved and damned, obedience and rebellion. And by the late 12th century, this church was feeling profoundly threatened. The Crusades to reclaim Jerusalem had opened Europe's eyes to other worlds, other ideas. Challenges to papal authority were sprouting up everywhere, but none were more dangerous than the Cathar faith in the south. For the Northern Church, the very existence of Occitania was a scandal. Its tolerance was seen as moral decay. Its intellectual freedom was viewed as dangerous pride. The troubadours' songs of courtly love were not romantic poetry. They were a subversion of the divinely ordained social order. This was the fundamental, irreconcilable collision. It wasn't merely a difference of opinion on a point of doctrine. It was a battle between two entirely different visions of reality. On one side, a decentralized, culturally vibrant society that allowed for spiritual seeking and held a somewhat skeptical view of material power. On the other, a centralized, militant institution that demanded uniformity and saw any deviation not as a simple error, but as a cosmic rebellion that threatened the very fabric of Christendom. The prosperity and independence of the southern nobles, combined with the widespread appeal of the Cathar message, meant that the Church's usual tools, excommunication, diplomatic pressure, were proving useless. The powder keg was not just filled with theological disagreement, it was packed with the northern aristocracy's envy for the South's wealth, the Pope's fear of losing his spiritual monopoly, and a deep, cultural contempt for a way of life they could not understand. All it needed was a single, catastrophic spark. At the heart of this looming conflict were the Cathars themselves, a people who called themselves simply the good Christians. To understand why the Church felt so threatened, we must step inside their worldview, which was as radical then as it is fascinating today. The cornerstone of Cathar belief was a principle known as radical dualism. They saw the cosmos as a battlefield in an eternal war between two fundamental, opposing forces. On one side was the God of light, a being of pure spirit, goodness, and love, entirely separate from the flawed, physical world we inhabit. This true God was the source of all that is transcendent and eternal. Opposing this divine spirit was the God of darkness, or the ruler of the material world. In their theology, this lesser deity, often associated with the vengeful God of the Old Testament, had crafted the entire physical universe, our bodies, the earth, the stars, as a vast, sophisticated prison. Matter itself was not sacred, it was corrupt, the very substance of evil. This belief had profound and shocking consequences. Because the material world was a prison, anything that bound the spirit to matter was to be rejected. This led them to dismiss the entire Old Testament as the story of the false creator God. It also meant they viewed the core sacraments of the Catholic Church not as channels of grace, but as traps. The Eucharist, which the Church taught, literally became the body of Christ. To the Cathars, this was the ultimate sacrilege, a ritual that celebrated and consumed matter, further chaining the soul to its corrupt prison. They rejected the cross, seeing it not as a symbol of salvation, but as an instrument of torture, a cruel reminder of the material suffering inflicted by the world's ruler. Even the institution of marriage was viewed with suspicion, not out of a disdain for love, but because it produced more physical bodies, more souls trapped in the cycle of reincarnation within this material plane. Salvation for a Cathar was not about forgiveness of sins through a church, but about liberation. The ultimate goal was to escape the endless cycle of reincarnation and return to the realm of pure spirit. This escape was made possible through a single, powerful ritual, the consolamentum, or the consolation. This was their only sacrament, a baptism not by water, which was, after all, just another element of the material world, but by the laying on of hands. It was a direct transmission of the Holy Spirit from one perfected individual to the seeker. For the vast majority of Cathar believers, the credents, this ritual was received at the very end of their lives, often on their deathbed. It was a moment of profound transformation, washing away all sin and freeing the soul to finally return home. But for a select few, the ritual was undertaken while they were still healthy, initiating them into the spiritual elite known as the perfecti. These perfecti were the living heart of the Cathar faith. After receiving the consolamentum, their lives became a relentless pursuit of purity. They took vows of absolute nonviolence, poverty, and chastity. They were strict vegans, refusing to consume any animal products, believing that animals too contained trapped souls. They traveled in male-female pairs, preaching, praying, and working in humble trades. What made them so dangerous to the established church was not their rhetoric, but their example. In an age where the Catholic clergy was often wealthy, politically entangled, and sometimes morally lax, the perfecti embodied a stunning authenticity. They lived with a radical integrity that commanded respect, even from those who despised their beliefs. Chroniclers of the time, firmly in the Catholic camp, would often grudgingly note the austerity and apparent holiness of these heretics, an admission that speaks volumes about the power of their witness. They were living proof of an alternative path, and their very existence was a silent, powerful sermon that the official church simply could not counter with words alone. In this simmering cauldron of tension, it would take only one violent act to tip the entire continent into war. That act came on a cold morning in January 1208 on the banks of the Rhone River. Pope Innocent III's chief legate, a zealous and uncompromising monk named Pierre de Castelnau, had just finished a fruitless meeting with one of the most powerful men in the south, Count Raymond VI of Toulouse. The meeting had been a disaster. Innocent had sent Castelnau to demand that Raymond take an unequivocal stand against the Cathars in his lands, to root them out and swear allegiance to the Roman Church. Raymond, a master of political maneuvering, had been evasive, offering vague promises he had no intention of keeping. He was a Catholic himself, but he ruled a land where Cathars were his vassals, his friends, even his family. To attack them would be to tear his own society apart. Frustrated and furious, Castelnau had publicly excommunicated the Count again before setting off back north. As he prepared to cross the river, an unknown knight rode out from Raymond's retinue, lunged forward, and drove a lance through the papal legate. The murder of a pope's personal representative was not just a crime, it was an earth-shattering act of sacrilege in medieval Europe. The news raced to Rome, and Pope Innocent III did not hesitate. He immediately declared the killer's hand had been guided by Count Raymond himself, labeling him an accomplice to murder and a protector of heretics. But the truth of that day on the Rhone is shrouded in mystery, lost to centuries of propaganda. Was Raymond VI truly the architect of the assassination? It seems incredibly unlikely for such a shrewd and cautious ruler. Provoking the full wrath of the Church and the northern French barons would be political suicide, and Raymond was no fool. A more plausible theory suggests the killer was a knight acting on his own, outraged by the legate's insult to his lord. Another, even darker possibility is that the murder was a deliberate provocation orchestrated by hardliners within the Church itself, those who knew that only a blood-drenched outrage would finally justify the full-scale invasion they had been craving for years. Regardless of the actual conspirators, Pope Innocent had his undeniable casus belli. The assassination was the perfect symbol of everything he feared, a world where secular lords felt they could murder the Church's agents with impunity, a land where heresy had so corrupted the social order that it led to the slaughter of God's own diplomats. Innocent's response was swift, brutal, and strategically brilliant. He issued a call for a crusade, but with a terrifying new twist. For over a century, the Church had been urging knights to travel thousands of miles to fight the Muslim infidel in the Holy Land. Now Innocent declared that the same spiritual rewards, the complete forgiveness of all sins, a guaranteed place in heaven, could be earned by fighting the heretics right here in Europe. This was the birth of the political crusade, a holy war turned inward. The Pope's call was a masterstroke of medieval realpolitik. To the northern French knights, the barons from the Isle de France, Burgundy, and Normandy, he offered a dual incentive: the salvation of their souls and the confiscation of the richest lands in Christendom. The Crusaders were granted a 40-day indulgence, the standard term of service, but more importantly, they were promised they could seize and keep the property of any lord found to be protecting heretics. This fusion of spiritual fervor and raw greed created an unstoppable force. An army of salvation was being mobilized, but its true objective was the systematic plunder of a more sophisticated, more tolerant, and utterly vulnerable civilization. The spark had been lit, and the fire of war now had both divine permission and a very earthly roadmap. With the murder of his legate serving as the ultimate justification, Pope Innocent III unleashed the full doctrinal and political machinery of the medieval church. In March 1208, he issued a formal papal bull that would echo through history, a document that did not merely call for prayer, but for a holy war of extermination. The official language was one of divine retribution and pastoral duty. Innocent framed the Cathars not just as misguided believers, but as a spiritual disease, a cancer within the body of Christendom that had to be cut out before it corrupted the entire faith. He invoked the Church's right and responsibility to defend the flock from the wolves of heresy, painting the tolerant lords of Languedoc as accomplices to a crime against God himself. This was the public face of the crusade, a lofty, terrifying call to arms for the defense of the soul of Europe. But to read the papal decree only at face value is to miss the cold, calculating genius behind its construction. This was not a spontaneous outburst of religious fury. It was a meticulously crafted instrument of policy. The political motivations were intertwined with the theological ones from the very first sentence. For Pope Innocent, a man who saw himself as the supreme monarch of the world, the independent-minded South was an intolerable anomaly. The Counts of Toulouse and the other Occitan lords operated with a sovereignty that directly challenged the Pope's vision of a unified Christendom under his absolute authority. By declaring a crusade against them, Innocent found the perfect tool to break their power and bring their wealthy territories under the direct control of Rome and its northern allies. This was about centralizing power, plain and simple. The heresy was the pretext, but the ultimate goal was political submission. Then there were the economic enticements, which were just as crucial as the spiritual ones. The papal bull explicitly promised the Crusaders the right to confiscate and keep the lands and property of any lord deemed a protector of heretics. This was a revolutionary offer. For the land-hungry, often indebted knights and younger sons of the northern French nobility, the sun-drenched vineyards and bustling trade cities of the south were a prize beyond imagination. The Church was essentially offering a divine license for plunder, turning a campaign of religious purification into a massive, state-sanctioned land grab. The 40-day term of service for a standard crusade indulgence was perfectly suited for this kind of warfare, just long enough for a northern army to descend, besiege a city, strip it of its wealth, and then either return home or move on to the next target. Salvation and real estate were being offered in a single, irresistible package. The marketing of this war to the Frankish nobility was a masterclass in medieval propaganda. The Church's preachers, led by figures like the fiery Cistercian abbot Arnaud Amaury, traveled from castle to castle, not just delivering sermons, but making a sales pitch. They painted a picture of the South as a land of decadence and sin, where heretics flaunted their errors and good Christians were led astray. They spoke of the Cathar perfecti not as ascetics, but as corrupt sorcerers. And they presented the Northern Knights as God's own avengers, a righteous army whose violence was not just permitted, but was a holy duty. The concept of the Crusade indulgence was the centerpiece of this campaign. The Church guaranteed that anyone who took up the cross against the Cathars would receive a full remission of their sins, a get-out-of-purgatory-free card that wiped their spiritual slate completely clean. In a world deeply fearful of divine judgment, this was an offer that could not be refused. It transformed what might have been a cynical war of conquest into, in the minds of the participants, a sacred pilgrimage. A knight could ride south, participate in the slaughter and looting of a city like Béziers, and return home not as a murderer and a thief, but as a forgiven penitent, his soul scrubbed clean and his worldly fortunes secured. This fusion of celestial and earthly rewards created an army with a uniquely potent and terrifying motivation, one that saw no contradiction between piety and pillage. In July of 1209, the crusading army, a vast and clamorous host of northern knights, foot soldiers, and camp followers, descended upon the prosperous city of Béziers. The city was a symbol of everything the Crusaders had been sent to destroy: wealthy, independent, and a known haven for Cathars who lived openly alongside their Catholic neighbors. When the army arrived at its walls, the commanders likely expected a swift surrender. Instead, the citizens of Béziers, confident in their formidable defenses and perhaps underestimating the fanaticism they faced, refused to bow. They even launched a daring sortie, a raid that quickly turned into a disastrous rout. In the chaotic retreat, a group of the city's defenders failed to close the gates securely, and in that single, catastrophic moment, the tide of the crusade turned from a campaign of intimidation into an orgy of annihilation. Frenzied crusaders, seeing the opening, poured into the city. What happened next was not a disciplined military action, it was a tidal wave of pure, sanctioned violence. It is in this maelstrom that history records one of its most chilling phrases. As the slaughter began, the story goes, the soldiers turned to the Pope's own legate, Arnaud Amaury, and asked how they were supposed to tell the faithful Catholics of Béziers apart from the heretical Cathars they had come to kill. His alleged reply has echoed down the centuries as a definition of religious terror: kill them all, God will know his own. Now, whether Arnaud Amaury actually spoke these exact words is debated by scholars. The quote comes from a chronicler writing a generation later. But its power lies not in its literal veracity, but in its profound symbolic truth. It perfectly captured the new, horrifying logic of this war. The distinction between orthodox and heretic, between guilty and innocent, no longer mattered. The entire society was condemned for its tolerance, for its failure to purge itself of the spiritual infection. The city itself had become the target. The massacre that followed was total and indiscriminate. The Crusaders swept through the streets, killing everyone they found. They stormed the churches where thousands of terrified citizens, both Catholic and Cathar, had fled for sanctuary, believing even the most fervent crusader would respect the holiness of the place. They were wrong. The doors were broken down, and the entire congregation was put to the sword inside the very buildings dedicated to God. The city was set ablaze, and the great burning of Béziers became a terrifying new landmark on the map of medieval warfare. Contemporary chronicles report a death toll in the tens of thousands, a number that likely includes many from the surrounding countryside who had sought refuge behind the city walls. The streets ran with blood, and the air was thick with smoke and the sound of a civilization being erased in a single day. The sack of Béziers was not an accident of war or a moment of uncontrollable rage. It was a deliberate, calculated act of terror designed to send an unmistakable message to every other city and lord in Languedoc. This message was simple and brutal: surrender immediately and deliver up your heretics, or you will share the fate of Béziers. There would be no negotiations, no nuanced distinctions, no mercy for those who harbored the wrong beliefs. The crusade had revealed its true face from the very beginning. It was not a mission of conversion, a campaign to win souls back to the true faith through preaching and debate. This was a war of extermination, a systematic effort to physically annihilate not just the Cathar faith, but the entire social and cultural world that had allowed it to flourish. The burning of Béziers established the Crusades' modus operandi for the next 2 decades: total war against a population where the only choices were absolute submission or absolute destruction. The terror radiating from the smoldering ruins of Béziers worked with chilling efficiency. Panic spread like a contagion through the towns and fortresses of Languedoc, proving the Crusaders' strategy of psychological warfare was brutally effective. The very next city in the Crusaders' path was Carcassonne, a majestic fortress city perched on a hill, renowned for its formidable double walls. It was the seat of Viscount Raymond Roger Trinqueval, a young, brave, and popular lord who was, ironically, a Catholic himself, yet a known protector of his Cathar subjects. As the Crusader host, bloodied and swelled with confidence, marched on his capital, Raymond Roger made a fateful decision. He evacuated the civilian population from the surrounding countryside directly into the citadel, trusting in its legendary defenses to withstand a siege. It was a noble gesture that would prove to be a catastrophic tactical error. The Crusaders arrived and laid siege to Carcassonne in August 1209, just weeks after the massacre at Béziers. The city was massively overcrowded, its wells insufficient for the swollen population, and the summer heat was relentless. Disease began to rip through the trapped citizens and defenders with a swiftness that surpassed any sword. Unlike the defiant citizens of Béziers, Viscount Raymond Roger soon realized the hopelessness of his situation. He attempted to negotiate, walking directly into the Crusader camp under a promise of safe conduct. It was a desperate gamble, and it failed utterly. The Crusader leaders, led by the Papal Legate Arnaud Amaury, immediately took him prisoner, a blatant violation of the medieval codes of chivalry and truce. With their young Viscount captured, the spirit of the defenders broke. The city surrendered after a siege of just 2 weeks. Its people were spared a massacre, but they were given a single, merciless ultimatum: leave immediately, taking nothing but the clothes on their backs. A vast, destitute exodus streamed out of the gates of Carcassonne, leaving all their worldly possessions, their homes, and their entire lives behind for the Crusaders to plunder. Raymond Roger himself would die a few months later in his own dungeon, a captive in his own castle, under circumstances that remain mysterious but point squarely to murder. His fate was a stark lesson to every other noble in the South. Even Catholic loyalty was no protection if you stood in the way of the crusade. With Carcassonne fallen and its vast territories now up for grabs, the Crusader lords faced a critical question: who would be granted this new, stolen dominion? The original leaders, like the Duke of Burgundy, had fulfilled their 40-day vow and were eager to return north with their plunder. They had no interest in staying behind to govern a hostile, war-torn land. The Papal Legate needed a new kind of leader, one who would not just conquer, but occupy, consolidate, and eradicate. His eyes fell upon a relatively minor northern baron who had distinguished himself through sheer, unflinching ferocity: Simon de Montfort. The choice was a masterstroke of grim realpolitik. Simon was not a man of vast lands or immense prestige, which made him dependent on the Church's favor. He was, however, a soldier of profound and ruthless conviction, a man whose religious zeal was matched only by his ambition. He accepted the title of Viscount of Béziers and Carcassonne, becoming the military dictator of the conquered territories and the new, terrifying face of the Albigensian Crusade. To understand the next 2 decades of relentless war, you must understand Simon de Montfort. He was the personification of the Crusade's violent logic, a man who fused a fanatic's faith with a warlord's cunning. Chroniclers describe him as a brilliant tactician and a fearless warrior, always at the forefront of battle, but his true genius lay in his mastery of terror as a political tool. He understood that to hold a land whose people despised him, he had to break their will completely. His campaigns were characterized by a calculated and systematic brutality. When a castle or town resisted, he would often bypass it initially, striking deeper into the territory to demonstrate the impotence of its local lord. He would then return, besiege the stronghold, and upon its inevitable surrender, he would deliver a grimly consistent punishment. The defending knights might be ransomed or imprisoned, but the Cathar perfecti found within the walls, and any lay believers who refused to renounce their faith were given a single, horrific choice: convert to Catholicism or be burned alive at the stake. The pyres lit by Simon de Montfort became a common and ghastly feature of the Languedoc landscape. This was not the impulsive violence of a mob, as at Béziers. This was institutionalized judicial murder carried out with cold deliberation to serve a dual purpose. Firstly, it fulfilled the Crusade's stated goal of physically eliminating the heresy. Secondly, and just as importantly, it served as a devastating psychological blow to the entire Occitan society. Each burning was a public spectacle designed to terrorize the population into submission, to shatter the networks of support that allowed the Cathar faith to survive, and to demonstrate the absolute, unforgiving power of the new regime. Simon de Montfort became the bogeyman of the South, a figure of such potent dread that his very name could reportedly cause children to stop crying. He was more than just a military opponent. He was an elemental force of destruction, a man who had been handed a divine mandate to erase a world, and who pursued that mission with a terrifying, methodical efficiency. The war was no longer a passing invasion. With de Montfort in command, it had become a permanent occupation, a grinding, bloody process of subjugation that would push the people of Languedoc to the brink of annihilation. Forced from their open cities and prosperous towns, the Cathar community and their protectors faced a stark new reality. The war of pitched battles was lost, the age of the siege had begun. But their defiance did not crumble. Instead, it retreated, climbing high into the jagged, mist-shrouded peaks of the Pyrenees foothills. Here, in this vertiginous landscape, they forged their final redoubts, a string of stone sentinels that seemed to defy both gravity and conquest. These were the Cathar fortresses Montségur, Quéribus, Pérepertus, Puylauren's, names that would become synonymous with a last, desperate, and almost mythical stand. To look at them today is to understand the nature of their final resistance. They were not castles in the conventional sense of luxurious, noble seats or administrative centers. They were something far more primal: sanctuaries carved from rock, eagles' nests perched atop near vertical limestone pillars, accessible only by treacherous, winding paths that left any attacking army exposed and exhausted before a single arrow was loosed. Montségur is the most legendary of them all, a place that has accrued an aura of prophecy and tragedy. Perched on a solitary, steep-sided pog or rocky peak, it was more than a fortress. It was the spiritual heart of the Cathar resistance after 1229. The lord of the area, Raymond de Pierre, at the behest of the Cathar bishops, had rebuilt the castle specifically as a refuge for the faith's beleaguered perfecti and believers. It became a sacred citadel, a functioning Cathar community in the sky. Within its walls, the rhythms of the spiritual life continued. Perfecti prayed, taught, and performed the consolamentum for those who sought it, all under the looming shadow of the Crusader banners in the valleys below. The castle was not just a military asset, it was a living declaration that the essence of their belief, the pursuit of spiritual liberation, would not be extinguished. Its very existence, visible for miles around, was a potent symbol of defiance, a constant, silent rebuke to Simon de Montfort's heirs and the Church's claim of total victory. Further east, the fortress of Quéribus clings to a narrow, razor-backed ridge, a masterpiece of strategic positioning often called the last Cathar holdout to fall. Its design was a response to the new technologies of siege warfare. Its walls followed the natural contours of the rock, making them incredibly difficult to breach with catapults. Its water cisterns were deep and reliable, and its storerooms could be stocked to withstand months of encirclement. Pérepertus, a vast fortress complex spread across a cliff face, was like a stone city in the sky, capable of sheltering hundreds of people and their supplies. These fortresses formed a defensive network, a chain of sanctuaries where the persecuted could find shelter and from which the ideals of their faith could be preserved. They were physical manifestations of the Cathar worldview, places that literally rose above the corrupted material world of the plains, reaching for the pure spirit of the heavens. Life within these stone perches was one of extreme hardship and profound purpose. It was a society under permanent threat, yet one that maintained its core identity. The daily routines of the perfecti continued with solemn intensity. They adhered to their strict vows, praying, fasting, and offering spiritual guidance to the soldiers and refugees who shared their precarious existence. The credents, the lay believers, took on the roles of defenders, craftsmen, and providers, their worldly skills now dedicated to the survival of their spiritual ideals. The community was a fusion of the mundane and the transcendent. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer mingled with the soft murmur of Cathar prayers. This was the ultimate meaning of these sanctuaries. They were places where a whole way of life, a complete counterculture, was being safeguarded against annihilation. They were not just hiding, they were preserving a flame, waiting for a time when the storm of violence might pass and their understanding of God could once again be shared in the open. Their resilience, etched into the very stone of their mountain refuges, became the final, most powerful chapter in the story of the Cathar spirit, and we shift our perspective from the battlefields and the burning castles to the realm of ideas. A more profound and unsettling truth about the Albigensian Crusade begins to materialize. This was not merely a conflict over territory or even over surface-level religious doctrine. At its deepest level, this was a secret war for the soul of spirituality itself, a systematic campaign to annihilate a rival esoteric tradition whose very existence posed an existential threat to the power structure of the medieval church. The Cathars were not just heretics, they were the guardians of a Gnostic stream of thought, a current of hidden knowledge that ran counter to the entire foundation of Catholic authority. To understand the true stakes, we must look past the political justifications and see the crusade for what it truly was, an attempt to control the spiritual narrative of the Western world by erasing a dangerous alternative. The core of this conflict lies in the fundamental difference between an exoteric religion and an esoteric one. The Roman Catholic Church of the 13th century was the ultimate exoteric institution. Its power was built on outward, public structures, a hierarchical clergy, universally administered sacraments, and a set of dogmas that demanded uniform belief from every member of its vast congregation. Salvation was a process mediated entirely by the Church and its physical rituals. The Eucharist, for instance, was not a symbolic reminder, but a literal mystery where bread and wine became the actual body and blood of Christ. This entire system rested on the sanctity of the material world as God's creation and the Church as its sole, legitimate interpreter. The authority of the Pope, the bishops, and every parish priest derived from their control over these tangible channels of divine grace. Now contrast this with the esoteric, Gnostic worldview of the Cathars. Theirs was a path of inner knowing, of gnosis. This was not a faith built on blind obedience to external authority, but on a personal, direct, and transformative insight into the nature of reality and the self. Their radical dualism, the belief that the material world was the creation of a flawed deity, was not just a quirky theological opinion, it was the key that unlocked this entire system of inner knowledge. If the physical world is a prison, then the path to liberation cannot possibly lie through physical rituals administered by a material institution. For the Cathars, the Church's entire sacramental system, from baptism with water to the Eucharist with bread, was not just incorrect, it was a sinister trap, a series of rituals that further chained the divine spark within humanity to the very prison from which it sought to escape. Their own central rite, the consolamentum, required no physical elements at all, just the direct transmission of spirit through the laying on of hands. This rendered the entire Catholic priesthood, with its vestments, its altars, and its holy water, completely obsolete. The Cathar perfecti were living proof that one could have a direct line to the divine without any of the institutional middlemen. This is where the threat becomes existential. The Church's monopoly on salvation was its source of power, both spiritual and temporal. The Cathar faith, by its very nature, dismantled this monopoly. It proposed that every individual had the potential, through rigorous personal discipline and inner awakening, to achieve spiritual liberation without the need for popes, priests, or penance. This was a democratization of the sacred that the medieval church could not tolerate. It's one thing to have a theological disagreement, it's another to have a parallel spiritual economy that operates entirely outside your control and, even worse, declares your entire operation to be not just fraudulent, but actively harmful to the human soul. The Cathars weren't simply preaching a different version of Christianity, they were preaching a different kind of spiritual authority altogether, one based on personal authenticity and inner light rather than institutional ordination. Consider the implications of their beliefs. By rejecting the Old Testament and the Creator God it described, they were effectively cutting the historical and theological legs out from under the Catholic Church, which based its lineage and laws on that very scripture. By viewing the cross as an instrument of torture rather than a symbol of salvation, they were rejecting the central narrative of redemption through Christ's physical sacrifice. This wasn't just heresy, it was a complete rewriting of the Christian story, shifting the focus from a single, historical act of atonement managed by a church to an ongoing, internal process of self-purification available to all. The knowledge they guarded, the gnosis of the soul's divine origin and its captivity in matter, was the ultimate subversive truth. If widely accepted, it would have evaporated the foundation of the Church's political and economic power, which was entirely rooted in its control over the material world and the bodies within it. This perspective transforms the Crusade from a simple act of religious intolerance into a deliberate, strategic act of spiritual censorship. The burning of texts, the silencing of the perfecti, the systematic destruction of the communities that supported them. This was not just about killing people, it was about killing an idea. It was an effort to erase a branch of the Gnostic tradition from the European record, to ensure that only one version of spiritual truth, the one that reinforced the Church's authority, would survive and be passed down to future generations. The pyres that consumed Cathar men and women were also meant to consume a way of knowing, a path to the divine that was independent, interior, and utterly free. The Albigensian Crusade, therefore, stands as one of history's most stark examples of a dominant institution using overwhelming force to maintain its monopoly on truth by extinguishing a competitor that offered a more direct, and in many ways more terrifying, form of spiritual freedom. Even as Simon de Montfort's military campaigns ground on, the Church's leadership came to a grim realization. Siege engines and swords could shatter castles and scatter armies, but they were blunt instruments against a faith that resided in the human heart. The Cathar spirit, driven into hiding, was proving more resilient than its political protectors. A new, more precise and insidious tool was needed to root out the last vestiges of the heresy, not from the battlefields, but from the villages, homes, and minds of the people. This need gave birth to one of the most feared and effective institutions in Western history, the medieval Inquisition. This was no longer a war of conquest, it was a systematic campaign of ideological purification, an effort to hunt the very idea of Catharism to extinction. The Inquisition represented a fundamental shift in the mechanics of persecution. Before its formalization, dealing with heresy was often a chaotic local affair, a mob stirred by a preacher or a lord acting on personal whim. The Inquisition changed all that. It professionalized the process. Pope Gregory IX, building on the foundations laid by his predecessors, officially established this new system in the 1230s, and its primary target was the scattered remnants of the Cathar community in Languedoc. For the first time, the Church created a permanent, centralized bureaucracy dedicated solely to the identification and eradication of unorthodox belief. It was designed to be inescapable and methodical, a machine whose gears were turned by canon law and whose fuel was human fear. At the heart of this machine were its operators, the Dominican friars. They were nicknamed the Dominicanes, a Latin pun meaning hounds of the Lord. This was not an insult, it was a badge of honor they wore proudly. They were the intellectual shock troops of orthodoxy. Unlike the often worldly and lax secular clergy, the Dominicans were an order founded on principles of poverty, rigorous education, and persuasive preaching. They were trained in theology and debate, capable of dissecting complex heretical arguments point by point. When they arrived in a town, They did not come with an army at their backs, but with a library in their minds. Their mission was to outthink the Cathar perfecti, to win the war of ideas through superior logic and learning. But when persuasion failed, their other tools emerged. They were the perfect enforcers because they combined the aura of authentic holiness with the cold sharpness of a prosecutor. The Inquisition's method was a chillingly effective blend of psychological pressure and judicial procedure. It would begin with a public announcement, a general summons for every person in a district to appear before the inquisitor to confess their own heresy and, more importantly, to denounce their neighbors, friends, and even family members. This was the genius of its terror. The process was secret. Accusers and witnesses were anonymous, stripping the accused of any chance to face their detractors. Interrogations were relentless, a blend of theological traps and leading questions designed to entangle the respondent in contradictions. There was no defense attorney, no concept of innocent until proven guilty. The burden of proof lay on the accused to demonstrate their orthodoxy, often an impossible task. Perhaps the most devastating weapon in the inquisitor's arsenal was the principle of seeking out not just acts, but belief. They weren't only hunting people who openly professed the Cathar faith, they were hunting for the believers in secret, those who had outwardly reconciled with the Church but continued to harbor heretical thoughts in private. To uncover this hidden guilt, the Inquisition perfected the art of using minute details as evidence. Did you refuse to eat meat or cheese? That could be a sign of Cathar asceticism. Did you avoid swearing oaths, a practice the Cathars took from the Sermon on the Mount? This was seen as a telltale sign of heresy. Did you show particular respect to a known perfectus, or did you fail to genuflect in church with sufficient enthusiasm? Every aspect of daily life became a potential source of incrimination, turning neighbor against neighbor and sowing a deep, pervasive paranoia throughout the society. The consequences of being named were dire. For those who confessed and renounced their errors, the punishment could be a public penance, being forced to wear large yellow crosses sewn onto their clothing for the rest of their lives, a permanent, humiliating brand that marked them and their families for social exclusion. For those who confessed but were deemed insufficiently penitent, or for those who relapsed into heresy, the sentence was imprisonment, often in harsh conditions. But for the defiant, the unrepentant, or the perfecti who refused to abjure their faith, there was only one outcome. After the Church declared them guilty, they were relaxed to the secular arm, a delicate euphemism for being handed over to the civil authorities with a strong recommendation for mercy that everyone knew would be ignored. The secular power would then carry out the execution, death by burning at the stake. This legal fiction allowed the Church to claim it did not shed blood while ensuring the pyres continued to burn. The Inquisition did not just kill people, it sought to annihilate memory, community, and the very possibility of a hidden spiritual life, creating a model of ideological control that would cast a long and dark shadow across the centuries to come. The mountain fortress of Montségur had stood for years as a defiant symbol, a sanctuary in the clouds where the Cathar spirit refused to die, but by the spring of 1243, the noose was tightening. The political landscape had shifted drastically. The once independent Count of Toulouse had finally submitted to the French crown and the Church, leaving Montségur as the last major bastion of open resistance. The French seneschal of Carcassonne, Hugh of Arcis, amassed a royal army of several thousand soldiers and laid formal siege to the Pag in May. What followed was not a swift assault, but a grueling 10-month blockade, a test of endurance against a fortress that was considered virtually impregnable. The Crusaders established their camp at the base of the mountain, cutting off all supply lines and settling in for a long, grim wait, hoping that starvation and despair would do what direct assault could not. Inside the fortress, life became a slow, arduous struggle. The community housed their numbered around 400 souls, a mix of soldiers, their families, refugees, and most importantly, an estimated 200 or more Cathar perfecti, the spiritual heart of the entire resistance. As the months dragged on, their supplies dwindled, food became scarce, and the harsh winter winds howled around the stone walls. Yet, remarkably, the rhythm of their faith continued. The perfecti maintained their prayers and their ascetic disciplines, offering solace and the consolamentum to those who sought final spiritual liberation within the besieged walls. This was not just a military standoff, it was a spiritual siege, a battle of wills between an army that sought to conquer a mountain and a community that was guarding the last embers of a forbidden knowledge. The military deadlock was broken by a feat of audacious daring and local knowledge. As the winter of 1243 wore on, a small commando of local mountaineers, loyal to the French crown, managed the impossible. On a frigid, moonless night, they scaled the sheer northern face of the Pog, a cliffside the defenders had considered unassailable. Seizing a small outer bastion on the eastern tip of the summit, they established a precarious foothold. From this position, they could now harass the main fortress directly and, crucially, were close enough to construct and man a trebuchet, a massive catapult that began to pound Montséguer's inner walls with a relentless, demoralizing rhythm. The psychological impact was devastating. The defenders who had felt secure in their lofty refuge now found themselves vulnerable, their sanctuary violated. Faced with this new, dire tactical reality and with their supplies nearly exhausted, the commanders of Montségur entered into negotiations. In March of 1244, they agreed to surrender. The terms offered were surprisingly lenient to the soldiers and laypeople. They were to be pardoned for their rebellion after a brief period of detention and confession. But for the Cathar perfecti, the men and women who had dedicated their lives to the faith, there was no such mercy. The surrender agreement stipulated a 15-day truce before the formal handover of the castle. Then a single, stark choice would be presented to every perfecti within the walls: renounce their faith and embrace the Catholic Church, or be burned alive as unrepentant heretics. Everyone inside Montségur knew what the outcome would be. Not a single one of the 200 perfecti chose to recant. What happened during that strange, suspended fortnight of truce has fueled speculation for centuries. On the night of March 15th, just before the surrender was to take effect, 4 individuals used ropes to descend the treacherous western cliff face of the mountain and disappeared into the darkness. They were not soldiers fleeing for their lives. According to chronicles and local legend, they were carrying the treasure of the Cathars. This was not a conventional treasure hunt for gold and jewels, though that is one theory. The mystery of what they carried away from that doomed fortress is one of history's great unsolved puzzles, a secret that has tantalized treasure hunters and occultists for generations. One compelling theory suggests the treasure was indeed material wealth. The Cathar community, supported by sympathetic nobles across Europe, likely possessed significant funds to sustain their resistance. This treasure could have been a war chest of gold, silver, and precious objects, smuggled out to finance future efforts or to support the remaining hidden faithful. The practicality of this theory is obvious, yet it feels almost too mundane for the profound symbolism of Montségur's final hours. A second and far more evocative theory proposes that the treasure was a collection of sacred texts and scriptures. The Cathars were known to possess their own versions of the Gospels and other religious writings, some of which may have contained heterodox interpretations or preserved ancient Gnostic teachings that the Church was determined to destroy. Saving this library from the flames would have been an act of supreme importance, a mission to preserve their intellectual and spiritual heritage even as their physical community was being annihilated. The survival of such texts could explain the persistence of Cathar-like ideas in later mystical and esoteric movements. The most radical and enduring speculation, however, points to an esoteric secret of monumental importance. Some legends whisper that the treasure was not an object at all, but a person, perhaps a descendant of a sacred bloodline, or a high-ranking spiritual leader whose survival was essential for the faith's continuity. Others suggest it was a specific relic or object of power, like the Holy Grail itself. In these tales, the Grail is not the chalice of the Last Supper, but a sacred stone or an emerald that fell from the heavens, a vessel of divine knowledge. The fortress of Montségur, with its unique, pagan-like alignment to the solstice sun, is often described in esoteric literature as the Grail Castle, the final repository of this ultimate mystery. The treasure smuggled out, then, was the very heart of the Cathar gnosis, the core secret of their direct path to the divine, entrusted to a select few to be guarded and passed down through hidden lineages. On the morning of March 16, 1244, the truce expired, the great wooden gates of Montségur swung open, the soldiers and lay people filed out, leaving their weapons and their past lives behind. Then the 200 perfecti, men and women, walked calmly down the steep path to a field at the base of the mountain, a place now known as the Champ des Cremats, the Field of the Burned. There, a massive palisade of stakes and timber had been erected, forming a vast, enclosed pyre. Without hesitation, they entered the enclosure, embracing their fate as the ultimate liberation from the prison of the material world. The fires were lit and the flames climbed high into the Pyrenean sky, consuming the last visible heart of the Cathar faith. The fall of Montségur marked the definitive end of the armed Cathar resistance. The organized Church of the Good Christians was shattered, its leaders gone, its sanctuaries fallen, but the four figures who had vanished into the night with their mysterious treasure ensured that the story and the secret did not end in the flames. The physical war was over, but the battle for the memory and meaning of what was lost had only just begun. The disappearance of those four figures from Montségur did not extinguish the story. It ignited a legend that has burned for centuries, far brighter and more enduring than the flames of the final pyre. The nature of that smuggled treasure, whatever it truly was, has become one of the great blank canvases of Western esotericism, a mystery upon which generations of seekers have projected their deepest hopes and most audacious theories. The most prominent of these, and the one that gives Montségur its profound resonance in the modern imagination, is the idea that the treasure was, in fact, the Holy Grail. But this is not the familiar chalice from Arthurian romance. In the context of the Cathar world, the Grail takes on a radically different character. For this deeply dualist faith that rejected the material world, the ultimate relic could not be a physical cup. Instead, esoteric traditions, particularly those revived in the 19th and 20th centuries, proposed the Grail was an emerald that fell from Lucifer's crown during his fall from heaven, a stone of pure, divine knowledge. Others suggest it was the sangreal, interpreted not as Holy Grail, but as sangreal, or royal blood, a cryptic reference to a sacred bloodline descended from Jesus himself. In this telling, the treasure of Montségur was the secret proof of this lineage, a knowledge that fundamentally challenged the Church's doctrine of a celibate, solely divine Christ, transforming the Cathars from simple heretics into the guardians of Christianity's most explosive and suppressed truth. This connection between the Cathars and the Grail was powerfully cemented in the modern era by a controversial German historian and SS officer named Otto Rahn. In the 1930s, Rahn became obsessed with the Languedoc, convinced that Montségur was the real-world counterpart to the Grail castle of Montsalvat from the medieval Grail romance Parzival. He argued in his books that the Cathars were the last inheritors of a pure, pre-Christian Gnostic tradition and that they had safeguarded the Grail until their final days. Rahn's theories, blending romantic nationalism with esoteric archaeology, did not emerge in a vacuum. They were eagerly absorbed by the upper echelons of the Nazi Party, particularly by Heinrich Himmler and his occult-obsessed Unearth Institute, which sought to prove the historical and spiritual supremacy of the Aryan race. For the Nazis, the Cathars were reframed not as a Christian sect, but as a noble, Germanic people resisting the corrupting influence of the Judaized Roman Church. This grotesque appropriation sent Nazi expeditions scrambling through the Languedoc caves and castles, not merely for treasure, but for evidence to support their twisted ideology, turning the tragedy of the Cathars into a pawn in the 20th century's most sinister ideological war. Beyond the Grail, other theories point to even more ancient and potent relics. Some researchers have drawn speculative lines connecting the treasure to the Ark of the Covenant, suggesting that the object's immense spiritual power, said to be capable of leveling armies, was the ultimate weapon the Cathars chose not to use, preferring martyrdom to the unleashing of such destructive force. Another compelling line of thought posits that the treasure was a library, a collection of Gnostic Gospels, perhaps even original writings from the time of Christ that presented a version of his teachings radically at odds with the orthodoxy established by the Church in the following centuries. The survival of such texts would explain the profound and enduring nature of the Church's fear. It wasn't just a competing faith they were fighting, but a competing historical record that could have undone their entire theological project. The treasure in this light is knowledge itself, the unvarnished, esoteric truth about the nature of God, the soul, and the path to liberation, a truth so powerful it had to be hidden away to survive. This enduring mystery has transformed the rocky summit of Montségur and the surrounding region into a powerful pilgrimage site, though not for the faith that originally persecuted the Cathars. Today, the mountain draws thousands of modern seekers, occultists, and spiritual tourists each year. They climb the steep path not to celebrate a Catholic victory, but to commune with the spirit of resistance and the echo of a lost wisdom. On the summer solstice, it is said that the first rays of the sun shining through the eastern gate of the ruined fortress align perfectly with a notch in the distant mountains, a phenomenon that suggests the site was chosen not just for defense, but for its ancient, sacred geometry. For those who walk this ground, the treasure is not a physical object to be found in a cave or a chest. It is an experience, a resonance. They come to feel the lingering energy of a people who chose the purity of their conscience over the demands of an all-powerful institution, to connect with a history where spiritual freedom was worth dying for. The legacy of the Cathar treasure, therefore, is not gold or jewels, but a perpetual invitation to question, to seek, and to remember that some truths are so vital they will find a way to slip through the fingers of their would-be destroyers and vanish into the night, waiting to be rediscovered. Even after the mountain fortress of Montségur fell and its heart was consumed by fire, the Cathar faith did not simply vanish. It retreated into the shadows, transforming from a public church with its own territories and perfecti into a phantom religion, a secret society surviving on whispers and sheer force of will. The war was officially over, but the Inquisition's hounds remained, their work shifting from crushing armies to hunting down the last scattered embers of belief. For the next several decades, the Cathar community existed as a church of the hearth and the hidden valley, its survival dependent on a clandestine network of loyal supporters who risked everything to keep the flame alive. These believers, known as credents, were no longer the open sympathizers of a tolerant society. They were now conspirators in a world where a single misspoken word could lead to the stake. The organizational structure of this underground church was necessarily fluid and cellular, designed for maximum secrecy and deniability. The few perfecti who had escaped the mass executions became spectral figures, constantly on the move. They could no longer travel in pairs preaching in town squares. Instead, they became nocturnal visitors, appearing under the cover of darkness at predetermined safe houses. These locations were often isolated farmsteads in the remote foothills of the Pyrenees, or the homes of trusted artisans in the back alleys of towns that had once been Cathar strongholds. The network was maintained through a system of trusted intermediaries. A baker might pass a coded message to a weaver, who would then alert a farmer on the outskirts of town that a perfectus would be arriving on a certain night. Knowledge was compartmentalized. No one person knew the entire route or the full list of supporters, ensuring that if one link in the chain was broken under interrogation, the entire network would not collapse. Life for these last perfecti was one of unrelenting tension and sacrifice. They were the most wanted people in Languedoc, their descriptions circulated by the Inquisition to every parish. To move safely, they often adopted disguises, posing as itinerant laborers, wool merchants, or pilgrims. They slept in barns, hidden cellars, and secret rooms constructed behind false walls. Their legendary austerity, once a public testament to their faith, now became a practical necessity for a life constantly on the run. Every knock on the door, every stranger on the road, could be an informant or agent of the Inquisition. The psychological toll was immense, living with the daily awareness that capture meant a horrific, public death. Yet they persisted, driven by a conviction that their mission to offer the consolamentum and guide souls to liberation was more important than their own physical survival. For the credents who sheltered them, the danger was equally real. Harboring a known heretic was itself a capital offense. The entire family, and sometimes their neighbors, could be implicated. The Inquisition actively encouraged people to spy on one another, offering spiritual rewards and a share of the confiscated property of the condemned. This created an atmosphere of deep-seated paranoia where even a family member could not be fully trusted. Would a son, fearing for his own soul or tempted by the promise of his father's land, report his parents to the Dominican friars? There are tragic records of such betrayals in the Inquisition's own ledgers. To be part of this underground church required not just belief, but immense moral courage. It was a commitment to a faith that offered no worldly rewards, only the constant threat of ruin and a painful death, all for the sake of a spiritual ideal that the world had tried its hardest to erase. At the very center of this clandestine struggle was the administration of the consolamentum, the one sacrament that defined their faith. Before the Crusade, this ritual of spiritual baptism had sometimes been a public event, or at least one conducted in the relative security of a patron's castle. Now it became a secret ceremony of profound gravity, often performed in the dead of night. A credent who felt the approach of death, or who sought the full commitment of becoming a perfectus, would send word through the network. If a perfectus could be safely guided to them, the ritual would take place in a locked room, a secluded barn, or even a remote cave with only a handful of the most trusted witnesses present. The stakes could not have been higher. For the dying person, it was their one chance for salvation, the moment of releasing their soul from the cycle of rebirth. For the perfectus administering it, it was the culmination of their dangerous journey, the act that justified their entire, harrowing existence. And for everyone in that room, it was a capital crime. The ritual itself was starkly beautiful in its simplicity, requiring no physical objects that could be discovered as evidence. The perfectus would place his or her hands upon the recipient's head, sometimes with a copy of the Gospels laid upon them, and recite the Lord's Prayer. This laying on of hands was believed to transmit the Holy Spirit directly, consoling the soul and reconnecting it to the realm of pure spirit. In the flickering light of a single candle in a hidden room thick with fear and devotion, this quiet act became the ultimate defiance. It was a declaration that the Church's vast apparatus of sacraments, its holy water, its consecrated bread and wine, were unnecessary. All that was needed was a sincere heart and the presence of one who had already received the Spirit. In these secret ceremonies, the Cathar faith distilled itself to its most potent essence, proving that an idea, once implanted in the human heart, is far more difficult to kill than in a person. This fragile, hidden world could not last forever under the relentless pressure of the Inquisition. The noose continued to tighten throughout the late 13th century. One by one, the safe houses were discovered, the networks infiltrated. The last known perfecti were being hunted down. The most famous of these final holdouts was a perfectus named Guillaume Bailibast. For years, he had eluded capture, even establishing a small, secret community across the border in Catalonia, a fragile attempt to preserve the faith in exile. But the Inquisition's reach was long. They planted a spy within his inner circle, a man named Arnaud Sicker, who pretended to be a fervent believer. Sicker gained Bailibast's trust over many months, eventually luring him back into French territory with the promise of meeting other hidden credents. It was a trap. In 1321, Guillaume Bailibast was captured. He was tried, convicted of heresy, and burned at the stake in the town of Villarouge, Termines. His death is traditionally marked as the end of the line of the Cathar perfecti. The organized, sacramental church of the good Christians, with its lineage of spiritual baptism, had finally been extinguished. Yet to say the faith died completely with Bailibast is to misunderstand the nature of belief. While the lineage of the perfecti was broken and the power to administer the consolamentum was lost, the ideas, the stories, and the cultural memory of the Cathars did not simply disappear. They seeped into the soil of Languedoc, becoming part of the region's hidden identity. The dualist perspective, a skepticism of worldly power and a yearning for a purer, spiritual truth lingered in local folklore and in the quiet, stubborn independence of the people. The memory of the perfecti, those ascetic figures of such compelling authenticity, lived on in family stories passed down in whispers. The flame of their public church had been brutally snuffed out, but the embers of their challenge to absolute authority continued to glow, waiting for a future time when the wind might change, and the questions they dared to ask about God, matter, and freedom could be posed once more. The disappearance of the last known perfecti did not mean the ideas they died for were permanently erased from the European mind. Instead, their radical spiritual propositions, the suspicion of the material world, the primacy of inner knowledge, and the rejection of religious intermediaries seem to have gone underground, resurfacing in new forms and under different names in the centuries that followed. It's as if the essence of the Cathar spirit, the gnosis they guarded so fiercely, refused to die and instead began a long, secret migration through the hidden channels of Western esotericism. While we must be cautious of drawing overly simplistic, direct lines of descent, the historical records of such secret transmissions are, by their nature, fragmentary. The thematic and philosophical parallels are too striking and too consistent to ignore. The destruction of the Cathar civilization in Languedoc appears not as an end, but as a violent dispersal that scattered the seeds of their thought across a continent. Consider the intellectual explosion of the Renaissance, a period that saw the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Egyptian wisdom texts, collectively known as Hermeticism. Before the Crusade, such ideas might have remained obscure scholarly curiosities, but in the wake of the Albigensian conflict, a world had been created where questioning church dogma was lethally dangerous. The Hermetic corpus, with its own Gnostic flavor, offered a compelling alternative. Like the Cathars, the Hermeticists believed in the possibility of a direct, personal knowledge of the divine, a gnosis achieved not through faith, but through intellectual and spiritual revelation. They too saw the material world as a flawed reflection of a higher, spiritual reality, though they often viewed it as a creation to be understood and mastered rather than entirely rejected. The key parallel is the decentralization of spiritual authority. Just as the Cathar perfecti demonstrated that holiness bypassed the need for ordained priesthood, the Renaissance magus sought to achieve personal divinity through his own study and will, effectively becoming his own priest. This shift from institutional grace to individual empowerment echoes the fundamental Cathar challenge, suggesting that the vacuum left by their destruction created a fertile ground for other, similarly structured, esoteric systems to take root. This hidden current flows powerfully into the mysterious Rosicrucian manifestos that appeared in the early 17th century. These documents told of a secret brotherhood, the Order of the Rosy Cross, founded by a mystic named Christian Rosencreuz, who had traveled to the East and returned with hidden wisdom. The manifestos called for a universal reformation of mankind, a revolution not in politics, but in consciousness. The thematic echoes of Catharism here are profound. The Rosicrucians expressed a deep suspicion of the established church and the secular powers entangled with it, mirroring the Cathar view of the material world's ruling powers as fundamentally corrupt. Their proposed reformation was to be built on a foundation of esoteric knowledge, available only to the initiated, a direct parallel to the Cathar division between the mass of believers and the enlightened perfecti. Most tellingly, the Rosicrucians spoke of a secret, invisible college of adepts working behind the scenes for the betterment of humanity. This concept of a hidden spiritual elite, preserving a threatened wisdom through the ages, feels like a direct intellectual descendant of the clandestine networks that sheltered the last Cathar perfecti in the Pyrenees. It is the organizational model of a persecuted faith, repurposed for a new age of intellectual and spiritual revolution. Perhaps the most significant and demonstrable vessel for this transmitted spirit is Freemasonry. Emerging from the guilds of operative stonemasons in the late medieval period, speculative Freemasonry transformed the tools and symbols of physical construction into an elaborate allegory for the building of the individual soul. The connections to the Cathar world are both geographic and philosophical. The Languedoc region, the very heartland of the Cathar heresy, is also one of the oldest documented centers of Masonic activity in France. More importantly, the core tenets of Masonic philosophy read like a sanitized, more socially acceptable version of the Cathar Creed. Freemasonry emphasizes the importance of a personal search for truth, independent of any specific religious dogma. It institutionalizes the concept of a direct connection to the divine, whom Masons call the great architect of the universe, without the need for a priestly class to mediate that relationship. This is a near-perfect structural parallel to the Cathar rejection of the Church's sacramental monopoly. While Freemasonry is not dualistic and does not reject the material world, its focus on using symbolic labor to perfect the inner, spiritual self mirrors the Cathar pursuit of purity to liberate the divine spark from its material prison. The Masonic Lodge, with its degrees of initiation and its emphasis on secret knowledge, can be seen as a safe, fraternal container for the kind of esoteric seeking that, 2 centuries earlier, would have led its members straight to the stake. This pattern of resonance suggests we are not looking at a series of coincidences, but at the persistent recurrence of a specific spiritual archetype, the path of inner knowing versus the path of outer authority. The destruction of the Cathars did not eliminate the human yearning for direct spiritual experience. It simply forced that yearning into new, more covert forms. From the learned magus of the Renaissance, to the invisible brother of the Rosicrucian manifestos, to the initiated brother in the Masonic Lodge, we see a continuous thread, a belief that true religion is a matter of personal revelation and moral living, not blind obedience to an institution. This is the hidden lineage, not necessarily of a specific organization, but of an idea. It is the lineage of suppressed wisdom that questions the very nature of power, both earthly and divine. The echoes of the Cathar War are not just in the stones of Montsager, but in the very structure of these later movements that dared to suggest that the path to God might be found within oneself, a secret so powerful that it had to be encoded in symbols and protected by oaths, ensuring its survival long after the last public voice of the good Christians was silenced. To fully grasp the spiritual landscape the Crusaders aimed to annihilate, we must turn our ears to the most enchanting sound of medieval Occitania, the song of the troubadours. We often picture them as wandering minstrels singing of chivalric romance, but this superficial view obscures a far deeper and more subversive reality. These poet-musicians were not merely entertainers. They were the cultural avant-garde of their time, and their central theme, the concept of finimur, or courtly love, was far more than a guide to wooing a noble lady. It was, in essence, a sophisticated spiritual code, an allegorical path for the soul's ascent, and it flourished precisely because of the uniquely tolerant intellectual climate that the Albigensian Crusade was determined to crush. The troubadours and the Cathars were 2 sides of the same heretical coin, one expressing through poetry what the other practiced through asceticism, a direct, personal, and unmediated pursuit of the divine. At first listen, the songs of the troubadours follow a familiar pattern. The poet, or lover, dedicates himself to a lady, usually of higher social standing, who is often married and thus permanently unattainable. He praises her perfect beauty and virtue, endures immense suffering and tests of character for her sake, and remains eternally faithful, all while demanding nothing in return. This relationship was not about consummation or possession. In fact, the physical fulfillment of desire was often seen as destroying the very nature of the love itself. The joy was found in the longing, in the constant, refined striving. Now, if we pull back the curtain of this romantic narrative, a stunning spiritual allegory comes into view. The idealized, unattainable lady is not a mortal woman, but a symbol for the divine, for Sophia, holy wisdom, or for the soul's own higher, purified self. The poet's endless, chaste devotion is not about earthly romance, but about the soul's yearning for reunion with its divine source. The suffering and tests the lover endures are the necessary trials of the spiritual path, the purification required to become worthy of such a sublime union. In this decoding, Finnemer becomes a map for gnosis, a path of inner transformation where the seeker, through discipline and unwavering focus, seeks to unite with a transcendent reality. This interpretation is powerfully reinforced by the language the troubadours used, a vocabulary steeped in spiritual nuance. They spoke of the joy and illumination the lady brought them, terms that echo mystical experiences of divine light and ecstasy. The lover's service to his lady mirrors the soul's submission to God. The entire dynamic was a radical inversion of the religious norms of the time. In the Catholic worldview, grace was a gift dispensed by God through the institution of the Church. In the troubadour's worldview, the grace of the lady was earned through personal merit, inner refinement, and steadfast devotion, a direct, personal relationship that bypassed all ecclesiastical intermediaries. This is why the culture of the troubadours and the theology of the Cathars were such natural allies. Both proposed that spiritual fulfillment was an individual quest, not a collective ritual. Both implicitly diminished the role of the priest. A society that celebrated poets singing of a direct, transcendent love was a society already primed to listen to preachers speaking of a direct, transcendent God, a God who required no corruptible bread or wine to be reached. The connection becomes even more compelling when we consider the historical and social overlap. Many of the most powerful patrons of the troubadours were the very same southern nobles who also protected the Cathar perfecti. Courts like those of Count Raymond, the Sixth of Toulouse, or the Trinqueval family in Carcassonne were vibrant centers for both the poetic arts and for religious tolerance. Troubadours and perfecti moved in the same circles, often protected by the same lords. It is not that the troubadours were secretly Cathars writing in code, though some may have been, but rather that they were drawing from the same deep well of esoteric thought and cultural rebellion. They were giving voice to the same spiritual restlessness, the same desire for a more immediate and personal experience of the sacred that the institutional church could not provide. The troubadour's song and the Cathar's prayer were different expressions of the same fundamental yearning for a world where the spirit was not bound by dogma. This cultural flourishing was only possible because of the unique social fabric of Occitania, a fabric the Northern Crusaders viewed with a mixture of contempt and fear. The courtly in courtly love refers not just to the setting of a royal court, but to a Chinese letter code of refined behavior, of courtoisie, which stood in stark contrast to the more brutal and rigid feudal culture of the North. This was a society that valued dialogue, intellectual curiosity, and the prominent role of educated, influential women. Noble women like Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter Marie de Champagne were not just passive muses, they were arbiters of this culture, presiding over courts of love where the finer points of amorous ethics were debated. This elevation of the feminine principle was, in itself, a spiritual revolution. In a church that often depicted woman as the source of sin, Eve, the troubadours exalted woman as the source of spiritual inspiration and moral guidance. This aligns powerfully with the Cathars, who ordained female perfecti, granting women a spiritual authority that was unthinkable in the Roman Church of the era. When the crusading army descended, they were not just destroying a religious sect, they were extinguishing an entire worldview. The culture of Finnemer was everything they despised. It was subtle where they were dogmatic, it elevated women where they subordinated them, and it championed a personal, interior spirituality where they demanded external, institutional obedience. The northern chroniclers who accompanied the crusade wrote with open disdain for the softness and decadence of the southerners, for their love of poetry, music, and elegant living. They could not or would not see the profound spirituality hidden within the art. They saw only a society that needed to be conquered and remade in the image of northern orthodox piety. The burning of castles and the massacre of heretics was also a burning of libraries and a silencing of songs. The war on the Cathars was, in equal measure, a war on the troubadours and the secret spiritual path they encoded in their verses. The vibrant, nuanced world that gave birth to this exquisite fusion of poetry and mysticism was systematically dismantled. its echoes growing fainter with each passing year of occupation and inquisition, leaving behind only fragments of song and a haunting question about the path not taken for the soul of the West. While the last embers of the Cathar faith were being hunted in the mountains, a far more earthbound, yet equally transformative, conquest was reaching its conclusion in the halls of power. The Albigensian Crusade, which began as a papal project to extinguish a spiritual heresy, culminated in one of the most significant geopolitical realignments in medieval European history, the birth of the unified French kingdom as we would come to know it. The war's true, lasting victory did not belong to the Church alone, but to the Capetian monarchs in Paris, who cannily used the conflict as a divine mandate for a massive territorial land grab. The independent, vibrant patchwork of Occitania was systematically dismantled, its lands forfeited by lords, condemned as heretics, and absorbed directly into the royal domain. This process was sealed by the Treaty of Paris in 1229, a document that formally stripped the once mighty Counts of Toulouse of vast swaths of their territory and handed control to the northern French crown. The Crusade had provided the perfect pretext, transforming a complex war of faith into a straightforward campaign of political annexation, all under the banner of religious righteousness. The cultural consequences of this political absorption were catastrophic and permanent. The world of the troubadours, of courtly love and intellectual exchange, depended entirely on a decentralized political structure where local patrons could flourish. With the northern barons and royal administrators now in charge, that world suffocated. The Occitan language, the very medium of that rich culture, was deliberately suppressed. Known then as the Languedoc, the language of Oc for yes, as opposed to the northern langue dialect, was a sophisticated literary tongue, the vehicle for the troubadour's poetry. Now it was demoted to the language of the conquered, of peasants and the disempowered. French, the language of the new rulers, became the mandatory tongue of administration, law, and high culture. This was not a natural linguistic evolution. It was a forced shift, a key tool in dismantling a distinct cultural identity and remaking the South in the image of the North. The songs of the troubadours did not simply fall out of fashion. Their social and political ecosystem was deliberately erased, their themes of personal devotion and spiritual longing replaced by the sterner ethos of orthodox piety and royal obedience. We must therefore confront a profound and haunting historical possibility. The destruction of Occitania represented the closing of a door on a potential alternative future for Europe itself. The pre-Crusade Midi was a remarkable anomaly, a society where relative religious tolerance, a thriving urban life, and a culture that celebrated the feminine and the intellectual could coexist. It presented a model that was radically different from the increasingly centralized, militaristic, and doctrinally rigid monarchies of the North. Imagine a Europe where this southern trajectory had been allowed to continue, to influence, and perhaps even to compete with the northern model. Could it have led to a continent with a greater inclination toward pluralism, where spiritual diversity was not a death sentence and where cultural identity was not so tightly bound to state-enforced religious conformity? The ruthless success of the Albigensian Crusade ensured that this particular path was not taken. It cemented a template for European state-building that prioritized uniformity over diversity, central control over local autonomy, and religious orthodoxy as the bedrock of political legitimacy. In the end, the war on the heretics achieved much more than the extinction of the Cathar Church. It engineered the disintegration of an entire civilization. The unique synthesis that was Occitan culture, its language, its poetry, its social codes, and its spiritual openness, was systematically broken apart and reassembled as a subordinate province of France. The vibrant, colorful tapestry of the South was overwritten with the gray ink of royal decrees and inquisitorial ledgers. The Crusade's legacy, therefore, is twofold. It is the story of a lost spirituality, but it is also the story of a lost world, a road not taken whose echoes can now only be heard in the silent stones of its mountain fortresses and the faded verses of its silenced poets. This double loss stands as a somber reminder of how often the quest for ideological purity becomes the engine for cultural annihilation, reshaping the map of the world and the possibilities of the human spirit for centuries to come. But what happens when we move beyond the chronicles and the legends and instead listen to the earth itself? For centuries, the story of the Albigensian Crusade was shaped by the words of the victors and the whispered tales of the defeated. Today, a new kind of testimony is being unearthed, one that cannot be lied to or distorted, the silent evidence of bones and stones. Modern archaeology is now peeling back the layers of time, offering a tangible, forensic perspective on this ancient conflict, separating grim historical fact from centuries of accumulated myth and propaganda. It is in the carefully sifted soil of massacre sites and the crumbling foundations of mountain refuges that we find the most unassailable truths about the cost of this war and the reality of the people who fought it. Consider the city of Béziers, the site of that infamous massacre where the command, "kill them all," supposedly rang out. For generations, the scale of the slaughter was a matter of historical record, drawn from chronicles that spoke of 20,000 dead. But where are these victims? In the late 1990s, archaeological surveys and emergency excavations in the city's historic center began to reveal a chilling physical reality. During construction work, contractors and archaeologists uncovered not one, but several mass graves dating precisely to the early 13th century. The bones within them tell a story that written records can only hint at. Osteology, the scientific study of skeletons, reveals a horrifying cross-section of the city's population. The remains are not just those of young men, the expected combatants. They are the skeletons of elderly women, of young children, of infants barely old enough to walk. The trauma found on these bones is not the clean cut of a sword wielded in battle between knights. It is the brutal, crushing damage consistent with farming tools, axes, picks, and hammers, weapons of opportunity used in a frenzied slaughter of a civilian population. The positioning of the bodies, thrown haphazardly into pits, some showing signs of burning, corroborates the chronicler's accounts of a city put to the torch and its people butchered without distinction. This is not a battlefield, it is a killing field, and its silent, crowded graves provide the material proof of a terror tactic designed to shock an entire region into submission. This archaeological lens also brings into sharp focus the daily lives of the Cathars themselves, moving beyond the theological debates to understand them as a living, breathing community. Excavations of what are known as castra, the fortified villages of Languedoc, like those at Montelou or Lastours, paint a picture of a society that was, in many ways, remarkably integrated. The old propaganda from the Inquisition sought to portray the heretics as a sinister, separate cult lurking in the shadows. The stones tell a different story. In these villages, the houses of known Cathar believers were intermingled with those of their Catholic neighbors. There were no separate heretical quarters. The material culture unearthed, the pottery, the tools, the animal bones, shows little discernible difference between the households of credents and orthodox Catholics. They ate the same food, used the same locally made ceramics, and practiced the same trades. This archaeological evidence powerfully refutes the idea of the Cathars as an isolated sect. Instead, it reveals a deeply embedded community whose spiritual differences were part of the normal fabric of daily life, a reality that made the coming war not just a religious persecution, but a fratricidal conflict that tore communities apart from the inside. Nowhere is the archaeological investigation more intense or more poignant than at the mountain sanctuary of Montségur. For decades, the site was shrouded in Grail legends and romantic speculation. Systematic excavations, however, have stripped away the myth to reveal the stark reality of a community under siege. Archaeologists have meticulously mapped the ruins, not of a grand castle, but of a small, Spartan village clinging to the summit. The foundations of dwellings show a cramped utilitarian existence. The artifacts found are not treasures of gold, but the mundane debris of survival, fragments of cooking pots, pieces of simple jewelry, nails, and arrowheads. Critically, the archaeological record confirms the historical timeline of the final siege. The sheer quantity of arrowheads and stone projectiles from trebuchets, concentrated in specific areas, maps the trajectory of the final assault and confirms the chronicler's accounts of the capture of the outer Barbican. Perhaps most tellingly, excavations at the base of the Pog have uncovered the remains of the Crusaders' siege camp itself, the post holes for tents, the remnants of field forges for repairing weapons, and the discarded animal bones that outline the sprawling, well-supplied army that patiently waited for the fortress to starve. This physical evidence on the ground mirrors the story in the texts, confirming the 10-month blockade and the overwhelming force arrayed against the defenders. But what of the people who endured that final, terrible winter on the mountain, while the main pyre site, the Champ des Cremats, has never yielded human remains? The heat of such a large fire would have consumed bones entirely. Other finds provide intimate glimpses of the defenders. Small, personal items lost in the mud of the summit speak to the human element: a delicate bone comb, a gaming piece, a pilgrim's badge. These objects remind us that this was not just a fortress of idealists, but a place where people lived, groomed their hair, played games, and held on to their personal faith even in the face of annihilation. The archaeology of Montségur does not debunk its legend, it grounds it in a powerful, human reality. It transforms the story from a mystical tale about a hidden treasure into a tangible tragedy of a community that made a final, principled stand, and whose everyday lives are now slowly being recovered from the dirt, one fragment at a time. The true treasure of Montségur, it turns out, is not a golden chalice, but this recovered truth, whispered by the very stones upon which these brave and tragic people made their last home. The story of the Cathars, once confined to the pages of medieval chronicles and inquisitorial records, has undergone a remarkable resurrection in the modern imagination, transforming from a forgotten historical tragedy into a powerful cultural myth. This revival began not in academia, but in the fertile ground of 20th century speculative literature, where the Cathars were rediscovered as the perfect protagonists for a new kind of esoteric mystery. The pivotal moment arrived in 1982 with the publication of Holy Blood, Holy Grail, a book that would irrevocably alter the public perception of this medieval sect. The authors, Michael Bagent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln, constructed a sprawling alternate history that connected the Cathars to a breathtaking secret. They were the guardians of the true Holy Grail, which was not a chalice, but the sacred bloodline of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. According to this theory, the crusade launched against them was not merely a war on heresy, but a desperate, brutal attempt by the Roman Church to eliminate the living proof of a truth that would shatter its very foundation: that Christ was mortal, had heirs, and that a literal royal bloodline, the sang real, persisted in Europe, protectively watched over by a secret society called the Prior of Sion. While Holy Blood, Holy Grail was widely criticized by historians, its impact was seismic. It repackaged the Cathars for a modern audience hungry for hidden histories and suppressed truths. They were no longer just austere ascetics. They were romanticized as the noble keepers of Christianity's biggest secret. Their massacre transformed from a religious purge into a cover-up of epic proportions. This narrative proved incredibly durable, providing the central premise for Dan Brown's blockbuster novel, The Da Vinci Code, which brought these ideas to a global audience of millions. In Brown's thriller, the clues left by Leonardo da Vinci ultimately lead back to the hidden truth protected by the Cathars and their successors. Through these bestsellers, the Cathar fortress of Montségur became synonymous with the Grail Castle, and the story of their annihilation was recast as a timeless battle between a liberating, hidden knowledge and an oppressive, dogmatic institution, a theme with profound resonance in an era of growing skepticism toward established authority. This literary reinvention quickly bled into other media, each adapting the Cathar myth to its own format. In cinema, films like The Last Cathar and various historical documentaries often emphasize the dramatic and tragic elements, focusing on the siege of Montségur and the final pyres, portraying the Cathars as peaceful martyrs massacred by a fanatical war machine. The visual medium powerfully reinforces their role as symbols of innocence destroyed by blind hatred. Even more fascinating is their appearance in the interactive world of video games. Titles like the Assassin's Creed series, which is built around a millennia-old secret war between the freedom-seeking assassins and the control-obsessed Templars, have featured the Cathars and their persecution. In this digital realm, players don't just learn about the history, they actively participate in it, navigating virtual recreations of Carcassonne or the Pyrenees, perhaps aiding a Cathar character in their escape from the Inquisition. This gamification makes the historical struggle visceral and personal, casting the player in the role of the resistor against tyranny, further cementing the Cathars' modern image as archetypal freedom fighters. Beyond entertainment, the spirit of the Cathars has found a new, literal home in the emergence of contemporary spiritual movements that identify as Neo-Cathar. These are not direct descendants of the medieval community. That lineage was broken with the last perfecti, but rather modern groups who find inspiration in the core principles of the ancient faith and seek to reinterpret them for today's world. Neo-Catharism is a decentralized and diverse phenomenon, with practitioners often engaging in online forums, organizing pilgrimages to sites like Montségur, and developing their own rituals and meditative practices. They are drawn to the Cathar emphasis on direct spiritual experience, their radical dualism reinterpreted not as a rejection of a flawed material creation, but as a philosophical stance against the pervasive materialism and consumerism of modern life. For these seekers, the Cathar path offers a way to seek purity of spirit, to live with greater simplicity and ethical consistency, and to connect with the divine without the need for a centralized religious hierarchy. So why does this story, 700 years old, continue to captivate and inspire with such potency? The answer lies in the powerful archetypes the Cathars have come to represent. Firstly, they are the ultimate symbol of spiritual freedom. In an age where many feel disillusioned with organized religion, the image of a community seeking God on its own terms, valuing personal conscience over institutional decree, is profoundly attractive. They embody the right to believe differently, to question authority, and to find one's own path to the sacred. Secondly, their history is a stark narrative of martyrdom. The image of the perfecti walking peacefully into the flames rather than renounce their beliefs carries an immense emotional and moral weight. It speaks to the power of conviction and the idea that some principles are worth dying for, a timeless story of integrity in the face of overwhelming force. Finally, and perhaps most significantly in our current climate, the Cathars have become an enduring symbol of resistance against oppressive power. Their struggle against the combined might of the Church and the French crown mirrors contemporary struggles against monolithic corporations, authoritarian governments, or any large, impersonal system that seeks to crush individuality and dissent. The Cathars were the underdogs, the small, resilient community standing up to Goliath. Their story validates the feeling of the individual or the small group who dares to challenge the status quo. The treasure smuggled from Montségur, whether literal or metaphorical, thus becomes a symbol of hope, the idea that truth and spirit cannot be fully extinguished by violence, that they will always find a way to escape, to go underground, and to re-emerge when the world is ready to hear their message again. The enduring myth of the Cathars is, therefore, not really about the 13th century at all. It is about us, our perpetual search for meaning, our reverence for courage, and our deep-seated hope that even in the darkest of times, the light of a different way cannot be entirely put out. Yet, with such a powerful and tragic story, it's almost inevitable that myth and legend would rush in to fill the gaps left by the flames and the lost records. As we've journeyed through this secret history, we've encountered tales of holy grails, sacred bloodlines, and hidden treasures narratives that are captivating and emotionally resonant. But to truly honor the memory of the people who lived and died for their beliefs, we must now take a more critical turn, carefully separating the compelling fiction from the often more complex and no less profound historical truth. The real courage of the Cathars does not require embellishment. Their actual story provides a powerful enough lesson about faith, power, and resistance. Let's begin with the most famous of these modern myths, the connection between the Cathars and the Holy Grail. As we've discussed, this theory, popularized in the late 20th century, suggests the treasure smuggled from Montsager was the Grail, reinterpreted as the sacred bloodline of Jesus. It's a thrilling premise, but when held up to the light of historical scrutiny, it begins to falter. The first and most significant challenge is the complete absence of any contemporary evidence. Not a single chronicle from the Crusade period, whether from the Catholic or the Cathar side, ever mentions the Grail in connection with Languedoc. The great Grail romances, like Chrétien de Troyes' Percival, were written in northern France and were part of a very different cultural milieu. The Cathars themselves, with their radical rejection of the material world, would have been the least likely people on earth to venerate a physical object like a chalice, or to care about a royal bloodline, which is the ultimate symbol of worldly, material lineage and power. Their entire theology was focused on escaping the physical realm, not on preserving a physical secret within it. The Grail narrative, while a beautiful metaphor for lost knowledge, projects a later, more romantic esoteric concern onto a belief system that was fundamentally opposed to such concepts. Similarly, the idea of an unbroken, secret society, a priory of Sion, or a Rosicrucian brotherhood that directly transmitted Cathar wisdom through the centuries, is a seductive but problematic notion. It provides a satisfying sense of continuity, a hidden thread of light that never went out. The historical record, however, tells a story of a far more devastating and complete destruction. The medieval Inquisition was brutally effective. Its meticulous records, which still survive, detail a systematic effort that broke the back of the Cathar ecclesiastical structure. They hunted down and eliminated the perfecti, the essential links in the chain of spiritual transmission. Without these perfected individuals, there was no one left to administer the consolamentum, the one sacrament that defined the faith. While ideas can certainly persist, the organized, sacramental church of the Cathars, with its specific rituals and ordained leadership, was annihilated. The later esoteric groups that seemed to echo Cathar themes were likely engaging in a form of spiritual rediscovery or parallel development, drawing from the same ancient Gnostic wellsprings, rather than receiving a direct, unbroken initiation from a surviving Cathar hierarchy. Acknowledging this doesn't diminish their significance. It simply means that the spirit of inquiry they represent is so powerful that it can be independently reborn in different times and places. This leads us to a more nuanced and perhaps more meaningful way to view the Cathar legacy. Rather than a literal, hidden lineage, what we see is a powerful recurrence of archetypal themes. The conflict between institutional authority and personal spiritual experience is a perpetual one in human history. The Cathars presented one of the most stark and dramatic examples of this clash in the medieval West. It is no surprise, then, that later movements facing similar pressures from centralized power, be it the church or the state, would find inspiration in their story. They became a template, a historical reference point for anyone arguing for the primacy of conscience. The Freemason who seeks light through his own reason, the Renaissance magus who seeks to know God directly through study, the modern spiritual seeker who distrusts religious bureaucracies, all can look back to the Cathars and see a precursor. Their legacy is not a secret society, but a symbol. They are the eternal underdogs in the soul's struggle against dogma. So, why does the temptation to embellish their history remain so strong? The answer lies in our own human need for hope and meaning. A story that ends only in pyres and silence is almost too painful to bear. The idea that a treasure was saved, that a secret survived, provides a narrative of resilience and ultimate victory. It assures us that truth cannot be fully vanquished. There is a profound psychological comfort in believing that the good guys, in the end, managed to get something precious away, that their sacrifice was not in vain. These myths are not lies. They are a form of modern folklore, a testament to how much we value what the Cathars represented. We want them to have won something, even if it was just the preservation of a secret. This desire itself is a powerful part of their enduring legacy. Ultimately, embracing a more evidence-based view does not rob the Cathar story of its power or its mystery. In fact, it deepens it. The real mystery is not about hidden gold or cryptic bloodlines. It is about the human spirit itself. How did those last perfecti, hunted and starving in their mountain fortresses, maintain the courage to refuse recantation, to walk calmly into the fire? How did a faith based on such severe asceticism attract the devotion of thousands in a prosperous and cultured society? These are the true, unanswered questions that make their history so compelling. By clearing away the speculative undergrowth, we can see the historical Cathars more clearly, not as mythic guardians of a physical grail, but as real people who made an unimaginable choice for the integrity of their conscience. Their treasure was not an object to be found, but the example they left behind, the stunning, sobering power of a belief so profound that it was worth everything. To comprehend the sheer panic that Cathar beliefs induced in the halls of the Vatican, we need to move beyond abstract labels like heresy and confront the specific, explosive doctrines that struck at the very heart of medieval Catholicism. This was not a squabble over the finer points of ritual or the date of a feast day. It was a demolition job on the foundational pillars of the Church's entire system of salvation, a system known theologically as soteriology. The Cathars weren't just singing from a different hymn sheet. They were claiming the entire church was a false temple, its sacred objects were cursed, and its path to heaven was a road leading in the opposite direction. Let's start with the most visceral and public symbol of all, the cross. For a 13th century Catholic, the cross was the ultimate symbol of hope, redemption, and divine love. It represented the moment God incarnate, Jesus Christ, willingly suffered and died a horrific human death to atone for the sins of all mankind. This sacrifice was the central, non-negotiable event that made salvation possible. Churches were filled with crosses. Priests made the sign of the cross over their congregations. Crusaders sewed crosses onto their tunics as a sacred vow. To venerate the cross was to affirm the core of the Christian story. Now, step into the mind of a Cathar perfectus. They saw this same object in a radically different, and to the Church, a horrifyingly blasphemous light. Since they believed the material world was the creation of a flawed, evil God, the cross was not a holy relic. It was the ultimate symbol of that evil God's cruelty and power. It was an instrument of torture, a reminder of the brutal suffering inherent in the physical prison of the body. To worship a cross, in their view, was to worship the very tool of the world's malevolent ruler. They argued that Christ, as a purely spiritual being, could not have truly been killed on a physical cross, making its veneration not just pointless, but a form of idolatry that celebrated the power of matter over spirit. For the Church, this rejection was an attack on the most potent visual metaphor for its entire mission. This leads directly to an even more profound point of contention, the nature of Christ himself and his resurrection. Orthodox Catholic doctrine hinges on the incarnation, the belief that the second person of the Trinity, the Son, took on a real, physical, human body, was born of the Virgin Mary, truly suffered, truly died, and most importantly, was physically resurrected from the dead, conquering sin and death through his material body. The Eucharist, the most sacred of all sacraments, makes no sense without this. The doctrine of transubstantiation teaches that the bread and wine literally become the body and blood of the historical, physical Christ. The entire liturgical life of the Church flows from this tangible, physical reality of God in the flesh. The Cathars dismantled this entire structure. As radical dualists, they held that Christ was a purely spiritual being who only had the appearance of a physical body. He was a divine phantom sent by the true God of light to teach humanity how to escape the material world, not to redeem it. His suffering on the cross was an illusion, a divine drama meant to convey a spiritual lesson. Consequently, his resurrection was not a physical, bodily event, but a spiritual one, demonstrating the soul's immortality. This view, known as Docetism, completely invalidated the Catholic understanding of the atonement. If Christ didn't truly have a body to sacrifice, then his death didn't truly atone for human sin. If his resurrection wasn't physical, then it didn't truly conquer physical death. the entire economy of salvation, as the Church taught it, collapsed into a meaningless charade. This theological divergence reached its logical and most politically dangerous conclusion in the Cathar view of the Church itself. The Catholic Church saw itself as the one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic institution founded by Christ, with the Pope as the successor of St. Peter, holding the keys to the kingdom of heaven. It was the sole legitimate conduit of divine grace through its 7 sacraments, administered by a priesthood whose authority was passed down through an unbroken line of ordination stretching back to the apostles. The Church was the ark of salvation in a stormy world. The Cathars, with chilling finality, labeled it the synagogue of Satan. This wasn't just name-calling, it was a precise theological judgment. If the material world was the domain of the evil god, and the Catholic Church was an institution deeply embedded in that material world, building grand cathedrals of stone, wielding political power, accumulating vast wealth, and claiming to dispense grace through physical substances like water, bread, and wine, then it could not possibly be from the good God. In their eyes, the Church was not just mistaken, it was the very opposite of divine. It was the institutional embodiment of the world's ruler, a vast and sophisticated deception designed to keep souls trapped in the cycle of reincarnation by distracting them with false sacraments and empty rituals. Its priests were not holy men, they were the jailers of the human spirit. The Pope was not the vicar of Christ, he was the chief agent of the false god on earth. The ultimate threat, therefore, was not just to Catholic doctrine, but to the Church's very reason for existence. Its soteriology, its system of salvation, was being declared not just incorrect, but actively malicious. Why would anyone confess their sins to a priest if the priest had no real power to absolve them? Why would they pay for masses to be said for their deceased loved ones if the Eucharist was just bread, and the soul's fate was determined by its own purity, not by a ritual? Why would they tithe to a church that was, in their view, the synagogue of Satan? The Cathar faith offered a direct, unmediated path to God that rendered the entire multi-layered, immensely powerful Catholic bureaucracy completely obsolete. A perfectus with no church, no vestments, and no property could offer a more authentic spiritual experience through the simple laying on of hands than a cardinal in his palace with all his sacramental authority. This was an existential threat that struck at the Church's spiritual credibility, its political influence, and its vast economic foundations. The Albigensian Crusade was the violent, desperate response of an institution that realized it could not win this theological argument with words alone. When your opponent declares you are not just wrong, but are the enemy of God, dialogue becomes impossible, and the only language left is that of the sword and the flame. In the starkly patriarchal world of 13th century Europe, where a woman's spiritual life was almost entirely mediated by the men of the Church, the Cathar faith presented a radical and deeply unsettling alternative. While the Catholic Church barred women from the priesthood and viewed them through a lens of suspicion inherited from the story of Eve, the world of the good Christians offered a path to the highest levels of spiritual authority. Within Catharism, women were not merely believers. They could become perfecti, female members of the spiritual elite with the power to preach, to guide communities, and to perform the faith's most sacred rite, the consolamentum. This was not a minor theological footnote. It was a revolutionary social statement that made the Cathar movement exponentially more threatening to the established order, challenging not only its religious doctrines, but its most fundamental assumptions about gender and power. Consider the landscape for a devout Catholic woman of the era. Her options for a dedicated religious life were essentially confined to the cloister, becoming a nun meant withdrawing from the world, living a life of prayer and obedience under the authority of a male abbot or bishop. While respected, nuns could never administer sacraments, hear confessions, or claim the spiritual authority of a priest. Their piety was personal and interior, their public role severely limited. The Church's theology itself was ambivalent at best about the female nature, often associating women with the temptations of the flesh and the physical world. Against this backdrop, the sight of a Cathar perfecta was nothing short of revolutionary. These women did not hide behind convent walls. They traveled in pairs with male perfecti, walking openly through towns and villages, engaging in theological debate and offering spiritual counsel to men and women alike. They were living, breathing proof that holiness and spiritual leadership were not the exclusive domain of men, a direct challenge to the very structure of medieval society. The role of a perfecta was identical in its demands and its authority to that of a male perfectus. After receiving the consolamentum, she took the same vows of absolute non-violence, poverty, and chastity. She adhered to the same strict vegan diet and dedicated her life to prayer, work, and preaching. Most importantly, she held the power to perform the consolamentum herself. This meant a woman could grant spiritual liberation to a dying believer, consoling their soul and freeing it from the cycle of rebirth. In a world where the Catholic Church denied women any role in its sacraments, this was a breathtaking inversion of the established spiritual hierarchy. A Cathar perfecta wielded an authority that a Catholic abbess, for all her piety and learning, could never possess. Her very existence undermined the foundational claim of the Catholic priesthood that only men could be legitimate conduits of divine grace. We know the names and stories of several of these remarkable women, preserved in the very records of the Inquisition that sought to destroy them. One of the most famous is Esclarmonde de Foix, a noblewoman of immense prestige and power. After being widowed, she did not retire to a life of quiet piety. Instead, she received the consolamentum and became a leading figure in the Cathar Church. Chroniclers describe her presiding over theological debates, helping to reconsecrate the fortress of Montségur as a sanctuary and acting as a key organizer and protector of the faith. Her social status, combined with her spiritual authority, made her an immensely powerful and symbolic figure, a living refutation of the Church's claim that women were unfit for religious leadership. Then there is the poignant story of Guillaume de Tarraga, whose journey reveals the profound personal commitment required of a perfecta. Born into a wealthy family, she was married against her will. After years in an unhappy marriage, she finally left her husband and her comfortable life, choosing instead the rigorous path of a perfecta. She traveled and preached, living a life of radical poverty and devotion. When she was eventually captured by the Inquisition, she faced her interrogators with unwavering resolve. Offered the chance to save her life by renouncing her faith, she refused. She was burned at the stake, a martyr for a belief system that had granted her a spiritual autonomy she could never have found within the confines of the Orthodox Church. Her story is not just one of faith, but one of liberation, a woman who escaped a worldly prison of social expectation for a spiritual freedom that she deemed worth dying for. The presence of these female spiritual leaders had a profound impact on the Cathar communities and made them uniquely resilient. Women were often the bedrock of the underground church that survived after the Crusade. They ran the safe houses, coordinated the secret networks, and risked their lives to shelter the persecuted perfecti, because their activities often took place within the domestic sphere, the home, the kitchen, the bedside. They could operate with a degree of invisibility that made them harder for the Inquisition to detect. A gathering of women in a home could be dismissed as simple socializing, when in reality it might be a secret meeting where a perfecta was offering guidance or comfort. This decentralized domestic resistance, led and sustained in large part by women, proved incredibly difficult for the centralized, male-dominated Inquisition to completely eradicate. The faith's inclusivity became a key to its survival. For the Catholic authorities, this aspect of Catharism was not just a heresy, it was a social contagion. A faith that empowered women so visibly posed a direct threat to the entire patriarchal order, which the Church saw as divinely ordained. The sermons of Catholic preachers against the Cathars are filled with venomous attacks on these female perfecti, often accusing them of being witches or seductresses, their spiritual authority reinterpreted as a form of dark sorcery. The Church could not allow the idea to spread that women could be the spiritual equals of men, could preach, could administer a sacrament, and could hold positions of leadership. To do so would be to unravel the social fabric of medieval Christendom itself. The persecution of the Cathars was, therefore, also a persecution of this radical model of gender equality. By burning a perfecter at the stake, the Church was attempting to burn the idea that a woman's soul was just as capable of connecting with the divine, and that her voice was just as worthy of being heard. In the end, the war against the Cathars was also a war against the spiritual potential of half the human race, a fight to maintain a monopoly on holiness that the good Christians had so boldly and tragically broken. Yet the Crusades' assault was not confined to castles and human bodies. It targeted the very medium of thought itself, the Occitan language, the vibrant Languedoc. This was the melodious tongue of the troubadours, the language of courtly love poetry, and the vehicle for the sophisticated theological debates that flourished in the open-air squares of Toulouse and Carcassonne. To understand the linguistic dimension of this conflict is to grasp a chilling truth. The eradication of a belief system requires the destruction of the cultural ecosystem that sustains it, and nothing is more fundamental to that ecosystem than its native tongue. When the Northern Crusaders and the subsequent French administration sought to impose their will, they recognized that the soul of Occitan resistance was encoded in its language, and so they waged a systematic campaign to silence it, understanding that a people without their own words are a people increasingly without a memory, and ultimately without a distinct identity to defend. Occitan was far more than a simple dialect. It was the language of a high civilization. From the 11th to the 13th centuries, it was the premier literary language of Southern Europe, rivaling even Latin in its sophistication and expressive power. The troubadours, the rock stars of their day, used Occitan to craft their intricate verses of finimur, their songs traveling from court to court, shaping the cultural consciousness of an entire region. But its use extended far beyond poetry. It was the language of law, of commerce, and of daily life for millions. Crucially, it was also the language of heresy. The Cathar perfecti preached in Occitan. Their theological disputes with Catholic clerics were conducted in Occitan. The concepts central to their faith, the distinction between the God of light and the God of this world, the meaning of the consolamentum, were articulated and understood within the specific semantic and philosophical framework of this language. To speak Occitan was to inhabit a mental universe where Cathar ideas could not only be expressed, but could feel natural, logical, and deeply resonant. The language itself was the fertile soil in which the seeds of religious dissent could take root and flourish. Following the military conquest, the new northern rulers implemented a policy of deliberate linguistic colonization. The Treaty of Paris in 1229 was not just a political document, it was a death sentence for Occitan as a language of power and prestige. The langue d'oil, the Old French of the Northern Royal Court, was imposed as the sole official language of administration, law, and education. Suddenly, to have any hope of advancement, to plead a case in a court of law, or to understand a royal decree, one had to speak the language of the conqueror. Occitan was forcibly relegated to the realm of the peasantry, the private home, and the disempowered. This was a classic strategy of cultural subjugation. By making the native tongue a marker of lower status and a barrier to social mobility, the invaders could ensure that, over generations, the conquered would willingly abandon their own language in favor of that of their masters. The vibrant literary Occitan of the troubadours began its long, slow decline into a collection of regional patois, its unifying grammar and orthography fragmenting as its formal use was systematically starved. Amidst this cultural devastation, the surviving written works of the Cathars themselves become all the more precious and significant. These texts are incredibly rare, as the Inquisition made a point of hunting down and burning Cathar libraries, seeking to erase their intellectual legacy as thoroughly as they had eliminated their spiritual leaders. That any writings survived at all is a minor miracle, a testament to the devotion of those who risked everything to hide them. The most important of these is the Book of the Two Principles, a profound theological work composed likely in the mid-13th century, perhaps by a Cathar thinker named Jean de Lugio. This text is the most sophisticated and systematic explanation of the radical dualist position that we possess. It rigorously argues for the existence of two eternal principles, one wholly good, the other wholly evil, and explores the logical consequences of this belief for understanding creation, sin, and salvation. It is not a simple polemic, it is a work of serious philosophy, demonstrating that Catharism was not just a folk superstition, but a coherent intellectual system capable of engaging with the most complex theological questions of its time. The survival of the Book of the Two Principles and a handful of other fragments, such as the Occitan New Testament used by the Cathars, allows us a direct window into their mindset, unfiltered by the accusations of their persecutors. These texts prove that the Cathar faith had a solid scriptural and intellectual foundation. They show us a community that was literate, theologically astute, and deeply committed to understanding the nature of God and the world through reasoned inquiry. The fact that these works were written in Occitan, not Latin, is itself a powerful statement. It signifies a deliberate choice to engage the common people in their own tongue, bypassing the clerical monopoly on Latin learning. This democratization of complex theological ideas was another reason the Church found them so threatening. The preservation of these texts, against all odds, represents a final, powerful act of linguistic resistance. They are the hard-won artifacts of a forbidden knowledge, whispering across the centuries in the very language that the Crusaders and Inquisitors tried so hard to extinguish, ensuring that the voice of the good Christians, though silenced in the public square, was never completely erased from history. To walk the sun-baked hills and winding paths of modern-day Languedoc is to feel the past not as a distant memory, but as a physical presence pressing in on you from all sides. The air itself seems to hum with a silent, persistent energy, a whisper of what was lost and what was defended here with such terrible finality. This region, now proudly marketed as Cathar country, invites not just tourists, but pilgrims, those seeking to connect not with a victorious history, but with the enduring spirit of a people who chose conscience over conformity. This is a journey into a landscape that is itself the most profound monument to their struggle, where every crumbling stone and soaring cliff face tells a part of the story. Begin your pilgrimage high in the Corbières Mountains at the fortress of Pierre. The approach alone is a lesson in the nature of the Cathar refuge. The road coils upward through fragrant scrubland, and then you see it, a seemingly impossible ribbon of stone, a castle in the sky stretched along a knife-edge ridge over 1,000 feet above the valley floor. The name itself, from the Occitan Pierre, meaning pierced rock, hints at its ancient, almost primal connection to the land. As you climb the final, steep path to its entrance, the physical exertion strips away the modern world, placing you in the footsteps of those who sought sanctuary here. Within the ruins, you don't find the grand halls of a royal palace. You find a vast, sprawling complex of chapels, cisterns, and barracks, all adapted to the brutal, unforgiving geometry of the mountain. Standing on the edge of the vertiginous drop, looking out over a sea of lesser peaks, you understand the strategic genius of this place, but more than that, you feel its purpose. This was not just a defensive position, it was a statement of defiance carved into the very heavens, a declaration that the spirit would rise above the corruption of the plains, no matter the cost. From this strategic marvel, the journey leads to the spiritual epicenter, the somber and majestic Pog of Montségur. If Pierre is a fortress that touches the sky, Montségur is a sacred mountain that wears a fortress like a crown. The climb is steeper, more demanding, a physical echo of the arduous path of the perfecti. Reaching the summit is less an arrival and more an initiation. The wind seems to carry a different weight here, and the silence is profound, broken only by its own echoes. You stand on the grassy plateau where a community lived, prayed, and ultimately made their choice, and you look down upon the field of the burned far below. It is a place that naturally evokes contemplation. Many visitors speak of a palpable, heavy sadness intertwined with an undeniable sense of peace. The ruins themselves are sparse, but their power doesn't come from their architectural grandeur. It emanates from the knowledge of what transpired here, the final, tragic act of a 200-year drama. On the summer solstice, when the rising sun aligns perfectly with the ruins, the site feels less like a relic and more like a timeless temple, confirming its role not just as a military redoubt, but as a carefully chosen spiritual sanctuary aligned with the cosmos. Descending from the high places, the pilgrimage finds a different kind of sanctuary in the town of Mazamet, home to the exceptional Museum of Cathar history. Housed in a former grain warehouse, the museum offers a vital, grounded counterpoint to the epic landscapes. Here, the story moves from the mythical back to the human. The exhibits are a carefully curated collection of the everyday and the extraordinary. You will not find the mythical grail, but you will find something perhaps more moving, a simple bone comb dropped by a defender at Montsager, a shard of pottery from a credence home, a lead token that served as a pilgrim's badge. These humble objects are incredibly powerful. They are tactile links to the individuals who lived this history. The museum brilliantly uses these artifacts, alongside clear historical panels and translations of Inquisition records, to rebuild the world of the Cathars from the ground up. It tells the story of their daily lives, their beliefs, and the brutal efficiency of the machine that sought to erase them. Walking through its cool, dim halls is a sobering experience, a necessary reminder that the castles on the hills were defended by real people with names, families, and an unshakable conviction in their hearts. This modern journey through Cathar country, from the breathtaking heights of the fortresses to the thoughtful quiet of the museum, ultimately forms a complete narrative. It is a pilgrimage that engages all the senses: the scorch of the sun on the climb, the taste of dust in the air, the awe-inspiring vistas, and the sobering touch of a cold stone wall. You leave not with a simple answer, but with a deep, resonant feeling. The landscape itself becomes the keeper of the memory, a vast, open-air cathedral dedicated to the ideas of resistance, spiritual freedom, and the price paid for them. To walk this land is to understand that the Cathar spirit was not truly extinguished in the flames. It was absorbed into the limestone of their sanctuaries, carried on the wind that sweeps the high peaks, and embedded in the quiet dignity of the region itself, waiting for anyone willing to make the climb and listen to its enduring, silent song. The embers of the last Cathar pyre had barely cooled before the chilling realization began to dawn across Europe. A terrifying new playbook for dealing with spiritual descent had been perfected in the Languedoc, and its architects were keen to use it again. The Albigensian Crusade was not an isolated historical tragedy. It was a gruesome laboratory that developed and tested a replicable formula for ideological extermination, a dark blueprint for intolerance whose core components would be deployed with ruthless efficiency for centuries to come. This was the true, enduring legacy of the war on the good Christians, the creation of a systematic template for persecution that fused holy war with state power, transforming religious difference from a matter of debate into a capital crime against both God and crown. At the heart of this template was the revolutionary concept of the political crusade itself. Before Pope Innocent III turned his wrath on the south of France, the idea of a crusade was directed outward against a foreign, non-Christian enemy. The Albigensian conflict shattered that boundary, establishing the precedent that a pope could declare a holy war against fellow Christians, offering the same spiritual and material rewards for killing them as for fighting Muslims in the Holy Land. This was a catastrophic shift. It effectively weaponized doctrine, creating a mechanism where any group labeled heretical could be redefined as an existential threat to Christendom, justifying their annihilation not just as a religious duty, but as an act of political hygiene. The success of this model was not lost on future popes and monarchs. Just a few decades after the fall of Montsager, we see it reappear in the brutal campaigns against the Stedingers, free peasants in northern Germany who resisted the authority of the Archbishop of Bremen. They were declared heretics, and a crusade was launched against them, culminating in a massacre at the Battle of Altenich in 1234. The pattern was identical. A local dispute over rights and taxes was escalated into a holy war through the application of the heresy label, allowing for their lands to be seized and their resistance to be crushed under the banner of the cross. The precedent set in Languedoc had turned the crusade into a versatile tool for internal pacification. Then there was the institutional innovation of the medieval Inquisition, a bureaucratic engine for hunting heresy that was literally forged in the fires of the post-Crusade Languedoc. Before its formalization, dealing with religious dissent was often haphazard. the Inquisition changed that, creating a permanent, professional class of investigators with the power to operate across political borders, compelled by canon law to seek out and destroy doctrinal deviation. Its methods, honed to a fine point against the Cathars, became a standardized export. The use of anonymous accusers, secret testimony, and interrogations designed to entrap rather than to understand created a legal framework where the accused was presumed guilty and the burden of proof was on them to demonstrate their innocence. This model was soon applied beyond the Pyrenees. The Waldensians, a pious movement originating in Lyon that emphasized poverty and lay preaching, found themselves in the crosshairs. While their beliefs were very different from the Cathars, they shared the same dangerous characteristic. They operated outside the control of the church hierarchy. The Inquisition, now a well-oiled machine, pursued them with the same relentless determination from the French Alps to the valleys of Piedmont and beyond, using the same procedural playbook to identify, try, and eliminate them. The economic incentive structure of the Crusade also proved to be a dangerously contagious idea. The promise that crusaders could confiscate and keep the property of condemned heretics was a masterstroke that turned persecution into a profitable enterprise. This fusion of piety and plunder created a powerful constituency for repression, a class of people who had a direct, material stake in the continuation of the heresy hunt. We see this model reappear with terrifying clarity in the early modern witch hunts. While the theology of witchcraft was different, the underlying economic engine was hauntingly familiar. Across Europe, from the German states to colonial New England, the confiscation of a convicted witch's property became a standard feature of the legal process. This provided a potent financial motive for accusers and local authorities alike. A neighbor coveting a plot of land, a creditor seeking to erase a debt, or a town treasury looking to replenish its coffers could all find justification in the pursuit of a witch. The Albigensian model had demonstrated that spiritual persecution could be made financially self-sustaining, and later persecutors learned this lesson all too well, turning the hunt for enemies within into a grisly form of economic redistribution. Perhaps the most insidious legacy was the normalization of a particular kind of propaganda, the art of dehumanizing the dissenter. The Cathars were not merely portrayed as being in error, they were systematically depicted as a disease, a cancer, a subhuman corruption that threatened the entire body of society. This rhetoric justified the unspeakable violence at Béziers and the cold, judicial murder of the Inquisition's victims. This language of contamination and existential threat became a standard part of the persecutors' toolkit. Centuries later, during the Hussite Wars in Bohemia, the followers of Jan Hus were branded with the same labels. They were not simply reformers with a different interpretation of communion. Papal bulls and imperial decrees described them as a pestilence to be cleansed, a viper in the bosom of the empire. This rhetorical framing made the ensuing crusades against them seem like a necessary defensive operation. Similarly, the victims of the Spanish Inquisition, whether Jewish converts suspected of secretly practicing their faith or Muslims forced to convert, were portrayed not as individuals, but as a hidden infection weakening the Spanish state. The language first perfected to justify the destruction of Occitan civilization had become a universal dialect of hate, used to rationalize the elimination of any group deemed a threat to the prevailing orthodoxy. Look at the trajectory from the 12th to the 17th century, and you can trace this dark blueprint as it evolves and adapts. The mass terror of Béziers finds its echo in the sack of Magdeburg during the 30 Years' War, where Catholic forces slaughtered most of the Protestant population in an act of religiously motivated annihilation. The systematic, record-keeping approach of the Inquisition is mirrored in the meticulous trial transcripts of the Salem witch trials. The confiscation of Cathar lands by Simon de Montfort is prefigured in the seizure of monastery properties during the Reformation and the seizure of Jewish assets throughout European history. The Albigensian Crusade did not invent religious violence, but it did something far more consequential. It organized it. It took the raw materials of fear, greed, and dogma and assembled them into a repeatable, scalable, and terrifyingly efficient system. It taught Europe that the most effective way to deal with a challenging idea was not to debate it, but to physically exterminate the people who carried it and to destroy the cultural world that allowed it to breathe. In doing so, it cast a long, dark shadow over the continent, a shadow in which the flames of countless later pyres would flicker, each one a grim reminder of the brutal precedent set in the sunny, tragic hills of Languedoc. From the vibrant courts of the troubadours, where poetry celebrated a direct, personal path to the divine, to the silent, smoldering ashes on the field of the burned, the saga of the Albigensian Crusade unfolds as far more than a medieval war. It reveals itself as a secret, systematic campaign waged against a competing esoteric spirituality that dared to offer an alternative vision of God, the soul, and the very nature of reality. This was not merely a conflict over land or political fealty. It was a brutal, calculated effort to erase a Gnostic tradition that threatened to dismantle the very foundations of the medieval church's power by declaring its sacraments a trap and its authority an illusion. The annihilation of the Cathar civilization was a deliberate act of spiritual censorship, an attempt to ensure that only one version of truth would dominate the Western world. Yet, as we have seen, the echoes of this war did not fade with the last Perfectus. They reverberated through the centuries, resurfacing in the hidden knowledge of the Renaissance Magi, the secret brotherhoods of the Rosicrucians, and the symbolic lodges of the Freemasons, proving that an idea rooted in the human yearning for direct spiritual experience is perhaps the most resilient force of all. The treasure smuggled from Montségur was not a golden chalice, but the enduring question the Cathars posed: who ultimately holds the keys to your soul? Is it a distant institution, or is it you, through your own seeking, your own integrity, and your own inner light? This question, so dangerous in the 13th century, remains profoundly relevant today, a timeless challenge to any system that demands unquestioning obedience. The price of spiritual freedom has always been high, paid in the currency of blood, fire, and silence. The story of the good Christians stands as a permanent memorial to that cost, and a sobering reminder of the lengths to which power will go to maintain its monopoly on truth. As we close this chapter on one of history's great hidden struggles, we turn the question over to you. What other lost spiritual paths or suppressed histories capture your imagination? Are there echoes of forgotten beliefs in your own part of the world, waiting to be rediscovered? Share your thoughts and the mysteries that intrigue you in the comments below. If you are drawn to these explorations of the world's secret histories, subscribe to join us as we continue our journey, unearthing the powerful stories that have been written in whispers, hidden in plain sight, and carved into the very landscape of our past.